Welcome to the World Poker Tour. I'm your co-host, Vince Van Patten.
And I'm one of your hosts, Mike Sexton here. And right here we have Legend of Benham Poker Stars here for a wired pair of fives right here. What's he going to do with those fives there?
East Coast Sam has ace nine of clubs. I really don't know if he should call here.
It looks like he's going to actually fold, and I don't believe it because an ace nine is just not going to fold that very often.
Woo! Yeah.
Guys, so we have dipped our toes around the World Poker Tour sort of poker chapter of the world. We've read a WPT branded book. We watched the primer about it. We've talked about Mike Sexton and Vince Van Patten, how they compared to on a number before. But today we are finally committing ourselves to a proper discussion of the World Poker Tour, along with a few other small topics here on the Two Fish at the Table Poker podcast.
Yep, so we decided to watch the first episode of the first seven seasons instead of watching one season all the way through. That's because we wanted to see how the World Poker Tour evolved over time in terms of its coverage. Yeah, it's been mentioned. It's something we've kind of dipped our toes into here and there, but we never really talked about it. That's because personally, I've never really seen it. This is the first time that I've ever actually watched a World Poker Tour episode from start to finish. I've seen clips and compilations in the past. But we're both sort of WSOP boys, I guess you can call it. Even though we had the Travel Channel, we had Discovery Channel, we have wherever this show aired on back in the day, we just never watched it, which is kind of strange because I watched a lot of like Anthony Bourdain and Andrew Zimmerman and those shows on the Travel Channel. I just never watched this, so it's good to finally sit down and watch these.
And again, like any classic debate, Coke versus Pepsi, store brand versus name brand, this is really kind of a World Series of Poker versus WPT, really kind of, you might have just grown up watching only one program like we did. So, if you wanted to take a peek and it's funny actually because although the main event had those sort of final table documentary-ish productions over the years, the first season of the WPT actually predates the first season of the World Series of Poker on ESPN as season one was in that '02 to '03 broadcast season. And so this actually it predates it by a little bit. And it's continues to this day. The WPT still exists up to, I think, season 23 or 24 right now. We never really got into the habit of numbering the seasons on ESPN or anything like that. But so in a sense, this actually is the older brother of the main event coverage on ESPN. And so like you said, Sam, we did watch the first episode, the first final table of each season because some of the seasons, or at least on YouTube, were broken into two halves. But we committed to watching the entirety of that first event just to sort of get the full story there. And I can't say I think that this is bad poker television. Like I've objectively felt that, or maybe subjectively, that some of those main events on the Poker Go or the later stage ESPN ones were just objectively bad. I can't quite put these in that category. I definitely feel that there are a great number of small changes year to year in the WPT, and I think slowly and steadily it does make for a better experience year to year over time.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil too much. I mean, we'll get into the season to season. We can kind of talk about our general thoughts here. Yeah, I mean, this was again a very sort of interesting watch. I didn't really have any expectations going into it. I kind of forgot that this actually predated the WSOP and we're starting in '02. So you have a lot of the, early personalities that were there in the poker room, maybe just slightly before in the coverage, actually in a number of these episodes. Though as time goes on, those personalities become less and less present. So I was, kind of curious to see like how are they packaging poker for television? Because the ESPN did air like hour-long documentaries on the World Series of Poker, mainly focusing on the main event final table in '02 and in '01. So this is really like a television show intended to broadcast poker, each episode being an hour and a half long, which is a very long period of time. You'd think it would be an hour at first and then maybe later on expand to an hour and a half. No, it's hour and a half right off the bat. And the coverage style is very interesting in that it really just focuses on the final table, and the final tables are different in that it's just six players instead of nine. So you automatically have a pretty big difference in terms of how the characters are being presented. You're going down from six to nine, an hour and a half long. You would think logically there's going to be plenty of time to get to learn each of these guys. You're going to be interviews with them. You're going to learn more about their stories. Maybe we can hear about them building up to the final table. And as Ben's smile kind of suggests, they don't really do that very much. Um, particularly in the early goings. I feel like, spoilers, there's really not much you learn about any of these players except for their table interactions and their style of play and whatever Vince and Mike Sexton has to say about them. But yeah, I mean it is kind of interesting to think about in terms of how poker is being presented, really for the first time on television, that there are so many hands and a wide range of hands that are shown in the coverage.
I mean, I kind of feel like the directorial editing structure of at least the first couple of WPTs kind of feels like the guy had ADHD because there is literally so much thrown at the audience. We have how to play poker. We have poker lingo, so many pop-up graphics that aren't really even acknowledged by the booth. Like in the World Series of Poker on ESPN, you had Lon and Norm. They had like poker facts, and they would have, Lon would describe like, the odds of making a royal flush when you have two cards that are, royal flush potential is 1 in 1,000, and he would actually tell you out loud you know, those graphic displays. Whereas here, a lot of little pop-ups and things on the bottom of the screen, on the corner appear, and Mike and Vince don't actually, read off them. So again, if you were blind, if you're, doing laundry while you're watching, or if you were, not, reading anything, if you're illiterate, you wouldn't catch any of that, really. And another interesting thing is, again, a lot of these bits are just so fast. Like you might have like we've joked about how, poor some of the interviews are in the ESPN broadcasts, especially later on. These made those feel like full-length movies because you might literally have like half a sentence worth, 3 seconds worth of something. And it's something pretty minute, like, oh, I didn't win this event last year, I'm gonna win it this year. Like that, that's it. And it comes and goes. And while there isn't really a formula, so to speak, as far as when to fill in these small little segments, like whereas ESPN kind of had a formula like every like 8 minute chunk between commercials, you might have one interview or one the nuts segment. There's not as much of a pattern for the most part, but at the same time, it did feel kind of overwhelming at times. Like if I was a brand new watching this on TV, this is now 23 years ago, it would really kind of maybe I might have a headache just from watching this from all the information on the screen.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. Yeah, that was a big problem I had in the early goings, just, poker lingo and this and that and the other thing. There's a couple little graphical things and editing things that I like. Like for one thing, they show the percentages of who's ahead in a hand and who isn't, which wasn't something that they really rolled out on the WSOP, I think. Not to the extent that they did here. They also showed chip counts on a pretty regular basis, usually like every 3 or 4 hands. So it's kind of nice to compare the chip counts on screen to the hands that we've actually seen. And like, oh, they've clearly cut out a couple hands where a short stack player chipped up. It's kind of fun to see, though there are occasions where there are typos in the chip counts. I also noticed multiple times that they showed the exact same chip counts like twice back to back. Did you notice that, Ben? They did that a couple
I
times.
missed that, but maybe it's because I wasn't really too focused on the exact numbers. To me, it doesn't matter if, half an hour into the episode, oh, he has 500,000, he has 400,000. It didn't matter to me too much, really. It wasn't something I was like, mentally recording in my head.
Yeah, I was recording that because again, I wanted to see like how many hands are being cut. I noticed that like, especially like a lot of the, a short stack might be at 200,000 chips, and then the next chip count that's shown they're at like 300,000, but they haven't shown a hand with them. Like I noticed they did that a lot, which is kind of strange. You think they'd want to build the narrative of here's the short stack, he's won a big hand, maybe he can come back, but they don't really do that. But I do like the fact that they do show the chip counts on a regular basis. Probably my favorite little editing trick is that they tend, in a hand where there's a player that's facing a big bet and they're sort of tanking, they'll do like a side by side of like the player who's about to act and the player who's just acted and kind of like build up tension side by side on the screen. I thought that was kind of cool. Lets you see both players at once and see what their facial expressions are like. And Vince Van Patten kind of hypes it up like, what's John gonna do? Is he gonna call the bet? Is he gonna raise? I thought that was kind of cool, built a bit of tension. But yeah, it's just tacky. Um, I described this before with the WPT that it's just very tacky. And the graphics are one thing. The other thing as well is the setup of the final table. That, it's the lighting's very bright. You have all these, random people just kind of watching off to the sides. Like there was a little bit of that at WSOP, but it was mainly family members. It was mainly people who were invested in the action, watching the action. Just kind of seems to be random people, and they'll just splice in like applause sound effects so many times, and you can tell that they're sound effects because they use the exact same sound effect episode after episode. Woo! Yeah, like you can tell. And then you can also look in the background, and you can see the players in the foreground in the focus, but in the background you can see people watching the action, and they're not applauding. So you can tell that this is audio that they just spliced in to make it seem more exciting, and it just comes off as really tacky. The set looks really fake too. We'll go into some of there's a couple comments I want to make about the sets later on, but it just looks fake and tacky and strange. So yeah, it's
Well, I
very.
mean, we saw in the poker primer DVD we got for them, those poker books, that they just literally just take their stuff and put it within the casino that the tournament's being held in. So I guess in a sense it is artificial because they are just, taking the same stuff and putting it in a location. So, you could take it for what it's worth. We mentioned how this was similarly done looking at the set in the movie Deal with Burt Reynolds, how that was again a WPT event and that was them in a very similar looking set. So again, it's all pretty comparable as far as the look. I didn't really mind the look of the set too much. I guess it didn't really bother me that much. I was, I just more viewed it as it's not quite the same as how the main event was run. So it wasn't a huge deal for me. Also present. So I guess just sort of leaning into season one here a bit more here. So these are 90-minute episodes. We have as the sort of floor host, kind of the Kara Scott equivalent, a lady named Shauna Hiat. And quite to my surprise here, although Mike and Vince are in the booth every season, at least for the first 7 seasons, that would change later on. This sort of floor host would change for the most part every season. I think Shauna is in the first 2 seasons, and then from that point on, it's pretty much a rotating basis, a new person each time. And they might even have had more than one person within a broadcast season. We just didn't get to see that because obviously we're watching one from each season. And Shauna, I think she gets a little bit more to do on average than say a Kara Scott would on your typical 45-minute episode of the main event. And how much that third floor host gets to do does differ season to season. But at least she does get her fair shake of utility in these early goings.
Yeah, and one other interesting thing is that Vince and Mike have their own booth like within the I don't know what to describe like the room that this is being taken place in. Like I thought that it was kind of like a set and they just kind of shoot to them. But no, they're actually in the room alongside the players. Like there's a shot at one point which kind of pans from their booth over to the table and the players I think in one episode I can't remember which one actually like went up to them at some point like interacted with them, which I thought was kind of strange. And it's also like, what is their commentary actually like while the final table is being played? Because obviously they can't say like, oh, John Smith has 10-8 of hearts. Like that's being recorded in post. So I'm wondering like, what are they actually saying and commenting on while the final table is
Yeah, I
going?
can address that because actually they were just they watch like a feed of it on delay and then as if it was live. Like they're watching it like in a continuous chunk, but they're not actually there while they're playing. It was all editing tricks actually.
Oh, okay.
This is
Editing.
on the wiki of WPT, so it's pretty convincing. And there was I
Yeah.
think season three or so where I was convinced that this was happening concurrently. And they also kind of talk about like as if they're like whispering like right here he's got a pair of fives, like as if he's trying not to be heard by the table, which is it's convincing so that they fooled me. I mean, obviously in '03 for the main event, they were like, we'll be right back to the coverage on the main event right after this, and as if it was live, and they dropped that sort of notion for the later seasons. But this one is definitely the most convincing. And again, until I looked this up, I was fooled just like you were. So that's something I noticed here. Other pretty common things in this first 1 or 2 seasons was poker philosophy, poker wisdom, poker corner, and poker like pop quizzes. And so these were most common sort of during the book ending shots of a commercial break. So you'd have like a quiz, there's a quiz, and then they'd answer it, or they'd show you like half of a quote and then show you like who said it after an ad break. And they don't actually have like Mike or Vince like say out loud like what these are. It's just more there for your visual. And so I'm not against it. I mean, again, there are worse things to have on screen, especially when this is the first season of really like mainstream poker coverage. Like this is again, this is before the poker boom took place, and so they're milking it for all it's worth. And again, it's only a few seconds a piece, but they literally have like 25 to 30 of these little things over the whole episode, and it was too much for me.
Yeah, it's just kind of sensory overload. You have these, very bright lights on the set. You have all these graphics on the screen. You have the audio over it. You have the applause. And then you have these, just sort of random bumpers. And it feels like they're filling time, which is so weird given you have an hour and a half. You look to what the WSOP did in the early era, in the '03 to '06 era, they were comfortable having like minute-long interviews with the players, and you actually got to learn a little bit about them, and they had the nuts and had sort of goofy material in there too. Like, and that was 45-minute episodes. And that didn't feel like they were, filling time. That felt very natural. So it's weird to feel that, to have an episode that has two times more length, but so much insubstantial content in that length.
Yeah, I know, I agree. Getting into the actual first final table here. This was at the Five Diamond World Tour Classic at the Bellagio in 2002, and this is back when, again, this is pre-poker boom, but this was a 10K buy-in event, and so you had only 146 players as a sort of inaugural event of the World Poker Tour. One of the poker books we talked about, sort of talk shuffle the deal, talked about the origin of the WPT, and so it's kind of nice to see it kind of in front of you on the screen here. And again, with 146 players, that's about, I want to say, like 1/5, maybe 1/6 of what the main event was that year with similar buy-in. And so again, this is, a small field, but I guess I imagine at the time it would have felt about right, given this was a new brand and this was a pretty big buy-in.
Yeah, all the fields seem to be pretty small. I mean, they were only like, still 300, 400 person fields even into the poker boom, which is still a sizable tournament. First prize usually was like $1 million or something like that. Yeah, one thing is, just sort of the payout table, which, the gap between fifth and sixth place is usually only like $50,000, $60,000. And then between like fourth and fifth place, like maybe like 75,000, $100,000, and then between first and second place is 500,000. So it's very, very top heavy, which they never really mention, which I thought, is going to influence your action if you're at the table, right? You really should be gunning for first place, but they never really bring that up, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, things like ICM weren't really a thing back then, so it kind of made sense. And again, this is poker from a long time ago. So again, like the idea of playing like Queen Nine is like a bad play. Like obviously, like we've joked about how the quality of poker was so much worse back then, or what was considered bad poker had a very different definition. Like if you had, if you didn't have like Ace King plus, then you're crazy to go all in or something weird like that. But and again, Mike and Vince sort of will sort of call out players by those standards. So it can make for weird viewing now from our modern poker perspective, but. It's still kind of funny to see them complain about, oh, we made a horrible call when he has like, if you have like 45% chance to win a hand, and you're getting good pot odds, then you make the call. It's not like, if you're, you really have to think about the math of it. Like it's okay if you have the worst hand right now, if you're going to make three times, what you put in for, and almost a coin flip, then, you go for it. A couple things that make these final tables really different from main event or even those preliminary events in the early main World Series poker seasons was that again we have a final six rather than a final eight or final nine. So that means that we do get more hands that aren't just eliminations or raise and takes. We get a chance to sort of dig our heels into the table, get a feel for how the game is going. Is somebody running the table over? Is somebody running poorly? Is someone getting someone carded? We get a feel for the most part of all six players within each of these events to get a sense of how frustrating their day was or how lucky they were. That's one positive of having not only double time at 90 minutes, but also having fewer players. But another big difference, and maybe Sam, you might agree with me, is that the blind structure was actually pretty aggressive. Like you have,
Mhm.
you might have like the blinds be 25K, 50K, and then next level is like double it. Like there's no like 30, 60, 40, 80 between like the structures there are very aggressive for these final tables.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, they tend to be fairly chip healthy as they're coming into the final table. There's usually sort of one short stack that's not so healthy, but it tends to be, again, pretty sort of top heavy in terms of the chip count. There's usually like a chip leader who's, sometimes two or three times ahead of the second place player. So yeah, I mean, I did find the blind structure pretty interesting. And again, they would mention the blind structure on a fairly regular basis, which was nice that you got to kind of keep track of how many big blinds each player had.
Yeah, and so getting to the actual flow of these poker events, because I didn't know the winner of these events, but in
Hmm.
the back of my head, I kind of figured that Gus Hansen would win this first one because I remember him being like a WPT champion. And so
Yeah.
seeing him play and be the chip leader, I felt like, okay, this is probably that event that he won. But obviously I didn't know how he got there. And so this first table had Gus Hansen in the chip lead, John Juanda, Freddie Deeb, the Prince of Poker starting to win, John Hennigan, a famous actor in the movie Lucky You, and then a guy I never heard of, Chris Bigler. And for the most part, I knew maybe at least three or four, or maybe not even five of the
Mhm.
six players for each of the tables, and then maybe a couple amateurs or players I just never heard of. And so I knew this table fairly well besides Bigler. And so I was, interested in seeing, again, these guys in their early days of poker by our metrics. With this, and also one important thing is that besides the first place prize, the structure of the WPT was if you won first place, you won an entry into the Tournament of Champions at the end of the season, which was normally a 25K buy-in, which I would imagine would be the highest buy-in tournament of that season. And so again, it's like an extra little 25K chip to add to your prize pool to incentivize playing. And I imagine it might have made for a pretty enjoyable sort of finale of the season because you have all these champions in there, and obviously all the richer players that can afford the big buy-in. So I could imagine that would be a decent incentive to want to get someone to watch the end of that season as well.
Yeah, and there was also a sort of World Poker Tour Player of the Year structure, like the WSOP Player of the Year, where I'm not quite sure what the point structure was exactly, but there was a Player of the Year sort of for each year. I don't think they got an additional award. I think it was just sort of like you're the WPT Player of the Year, congratulations. And also, each winner would get a free beer at the end, which is an extra little incentive to do well.
Yeah, we'll get to the beer stuff a little bit later. That's more important a little bit later. But
Mhm.
each episode in season one, at least, began with this sort of how to play video where they splice together clips from the final table of like the actual players, at least in this season, playing. And so again, a bit more of a fancier version of that sort of auto-produced version from ESPN that they used for the first couple of seasons. And so that was, and again, it reminded me again of the Poker Primer video that we watched. Which I want to say used clips from like the first two seasons, maybe just season two. I want to say
Mhm.
we're in that ballpark if I rack my brain for how that looked.
Yeah, I thought the graphics in this intro looked like a 1980s educational video. Like it reminded me of when I was in elementary school, which was in the early mid 2000s. They'd bring the television out, they'd roll it out, and they'd play like a little VHS tape of like healthy eating. Hi, I'm a celebrity from a 1980s television show. I'm going to tell you healthy eating. Like that's what this reminded me of. The graphics again, as we've mentioned, were just overkill, but particularly at that point, like I was laughing at how bad the graphics were.
And speaking of the graphics, again, they go through as you would expect, a progression year to year. They'll change a little bit. I wouldn't say enough to be warrant like, oh, this font is different. But I'm not going to mention each for each season, but they
Mhm.
change here and there, not just the actual like appearance, but also maybe the location slightly or how often the pot size is shown. Little things like that will adapt over the time. And I think definitely gets better year to year,
Mhm.
if you
Mhm.
ask me. As far as the actual poker play, I mean, I did take notes on all the big stuff. Did somebody go was all in and then was behind, then was ahead, then doubled up or whatever. I did that, there are definitely highlights within each table. One note I did put was that they refer to ace eight as a marginal hand. And I would say you could maybe argue it's a marginal hand, but only when you're nine-handed. Six-handed, I think it's a pretty strong hand. I don't know about you.
Yeah, absolutely. Six-handed and then 5, 4, 3, two-handed. It's a pretty good hand. Yeah, the lingo is just kind of interesting, as Ben alluded to at the start of this. There's this frequent reference to like a wired pair. If you have pocket fives or pocket sixes, Mike Sexton will say, he has a wired pair of sixes. He has a wired pair of fives, which I've never heard before or since. So I don't know if that's a piece of lingo Mike Sexton introduced or he heard somewhere earlier in his career, but I found that kind of interesting.
It kind of bugged me. And also, if you're, pretty flop, those are the only cards you have. So it's by default a wired pair. So just say a pair of fives. I mean, if it's one thing if we like went to a commercial break, came back mid-hand, and we saw the board and we didn't see the player's whole cards, and then he at least said, "Oh, he's got a wired pair of fives." That kind of makes sense in that context because we don't know how the fives factors into their hand. But if again pre-flop, we know it's a pocket pair. It's called a pocket pair. They don't use that phrase really at all. That kind of irked me. And another thing that kind of one of those kind of irk points for me was when a player wins a hand, it will say like on the screen wins pot, and they'll show the pot size and they'll win that much. But if the pot's like $100 and I bet 1 million, and then you fold, the screen will say wins 1,100,000 pot. Like just call it $100 pot. I mean, or how much they profited off the hand. Like it's just kind of silly when they do it, considering that there's a lot of like pot size betting or over betting, so it makes the pot size look kind of misleading.
Yeah, and another irk thing is that they refer to pots as, dollars. Like he won $100,000. No, he won 100,000 in chips, not dollars.
I know, especially
It's a
since
little thing, but
like
yeah.
again, it's when the tournament when you get 10K in chips for a 10K buy-in and it's a 1-to-1 ratio, okay, maybe I give you a pass there, but they did not have that in this case, so that did not apply. So that there. As far as I did break down like when the blinds went up here and there, and so in that first sort of level of play, there was a pretty amusing hand where there was three players flopping a flush draw, and then two more of that suit come out on the turn river. It's just kind of funny when all the suit basically is on display in one hand. Uh, that was an all in between Hennigan and Joanda, so that was pretty amusing. And as the table goes on, Gus Hansen, as a chip witter and a aggressive player that he was at this time, he's obviously playing, pushing the action, playing, less than premium cards, which most chip witters should do, especially when you have such big pay jumps.
Hmm.
But it's kind of funny seeing some of the other players' reactions to that style because they kind of refer to him like he played bad, he's horrible. I'm pissed that he beat me. But it's like, he's he's trying to win, and if it's obviously working, and it just seems more like sour grapes than it is like proper analysis.
Yeah, I mean, playing loose like that means when you have a big hand, you get less respect, right? Like, oh, you're going crazy. Of course, I'll call you. There's a method to the madness there. And Hansen was, one of the first major players to debut a style like that. And this was '02. So I understand that they're a little upset about that. But yeah, to call him an outright bad player, when he used aggression meaningfully. It wasn't like he was playing any two cards. There were a number of pots where, he did make good folds and good calls. It's just very strange. It is
Yeah,
strange to hear that.
and one issue I did have with this early season was every 30 minutes there was a properly timed like recap montage of the action so far, and so at the 30-minute mark, the 1 hour mark, and then there's not a 90-minute mark because it's over. But I was like, oh my God, here we go again, another recap. It's like I don't really think you need to, because if this was clearly would have been aired in like a 2 hour block on television with ads, or maybe probably not 2.5 hours, probably 2 hours. And so you really don't need that. I mean, if someone's coming in halfway through, they're just going to watch shows next hand. Don't waste our time showing that sort of thing. And intermixed with the very brief interviews of some of the players, we do have the occasional, whether it's like a spotlight for the location of the tournament. So in this case, the Bellagio. So we have a brief bit of Shauna sort of seeing the poker room and seeing some of the amenities. And again, this is a fairly commonplace. We've seen this now in civil programs. So I guess I kind of get a good pass. I mean, at least it was Shauna like in person at these spots rather than Mike and Vince doing it. So I guess that was okay. I mean, usually those poker room scenes have some of the players talking to what like someone who runs the show, like how that is going. And again, I'm not again. It's not as bad as when it was just like this is the Bellagio. This is the pool. That's the food. It's a bit better than that. So I guess I gave him a pass in that respect.
Yeah, I forgot that this was on the travel channel. So it's like you're plugging this place that people can go and travel to. It's kind of with the theme of being on the travel channel. So, I'm willing to let it slide a little bit, but I did find it annoying, this one in particular, because it really felt like it went on for a little too long and it kind of came in the middle of nowhere. Scotty Wynn had just busted. You're down to five hands. Here we go. Like a big major player has just busted from the table. What's the action going to be like? And then you cut to this. Just kind of strange to put in. Yeah, like I don't like it personally, but that's just
No,
me.
I mean, I know I know a little bit, but given the Travel Channel background and a few other things, it was not as bad as say the Poker Superstars Invitational
Yeah.
season 3 stuff. At least I'll give them that. And besides that, there really aren't too many like cut away from the table bits. Although something that was kind of amusing was that the YouTuber that put these episodes on YouTube. He included a lot of the poker site ads, like for Full Tilt Poker, Party Poker, and that was kind of nostalgic. Because I remember seeing those all the time on ESPN and all the like. So again, it has like Mike Mattisau like playing a hand against Alan Cunningham, like you got lucky. Like it's kind of funny little Mike Mattisau moments there and player cameos. So again, it's kind of fun to see these like almost 25-year-old ads again.
Yeah, it was fun to see those. It's just kind of funny to think that there used to be these like big poker commercials. Like I remember, that like Budweiser commercial with Chris Ferguson. He's like in the fridge. Do you
Yeah,
remember that
hold
commercial?
him or fold him.
Yeah, like just those like quirky little commercials that they used to have because this was the poker boom and the build up to the poker boom. So it was legitimate to be a poker player. And post Black Friday, that's all gone away, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean you can kind of tell by how Ben and I are talking. The action for this episode to me just really wasn't interesting. I tried to take notes on every single hand what the action was. just nothing super interesting. I mean, I give credit to Gus Hansen, who does wind up winning. Spoilers. I think he played a good game, pushed the action where he needed to, but nothing super exciting. Bigler, the only amateur, really doesn't get anything going. Scotty to win busts early, but it's not really as big of a moment as they try to make it out to be. Nothing super exciting. It was interesting to watch just to kind of be like, this is the first episode of the WPT. This is the starting point. Where does it go from here? But this isn't something I can recommend in terms of, oh my God, you got to watch this. The poker is so cool.
I mean, I thought that one of the more interesting things to take note was just sort of the raw dynamic feel of the camera work. Like
Yeah.
compared to the main event where it was very like a fixed camera at the featured table, compared not kind of the outer table stuff, that's a subsequent matter. You'd have like it'd be like this is in the hand, and again, it could be a little strange coming from like fixed camera angles to this sort of move. And I feel like the camera work did get a bit more steady over the seasons as it went on, but especially for this early one, definitely felt like a different kind of directorial vibe for the table. Um, and at least for even if the action isn't amazing, the pace is pretty fast. Like the hands don't really linger for all that long. I mean, there were a few times where they'll cut to commercial mid-hand, which I don't really like. And then you mentioned sort of like the heads up view, like where it's a 1v1 hand and it'll cut to like the screen will be like this. This like really weird music will play in the background for the first couple of seasons. And I didn't like the music really. I thought it was kind of strange and I didn't really think it added much. Especially when a player makes a bet and then the other player is thinking the other guy is like a statue, so there's really not much point in showing him. I mean, I thought that was kind of a weird choice. First, I know you said you kind of liked it. I didn't really feel it had much to it personally, because if I'm a statue, then having the camera on me with the other guy, I want to focus on the guy with the decision. Then if he's moving during the decision making, that's one thing. But he wasn't. But most of the time, there's a statue at that point.
Yeah, it was the times when they were moving around and, looking at each other and bantering that I think that worked a bit better. Or, one guy would try to talk to the other guy and the other guy wouldn't talk, which I always find funny. I don't know why at a poker table when one guy's like, what do you have? And the other player doesn't say anything. I always like moments like that. It's just like a little bit different to have the sort of side by side camera angles like that. At the WSOP, they didn't really do that. They'd have shot, reverse shot, and cut back and forth. Or if two players are sitting next to each other, then they'd have a wide shot of the two of them. I just thought it added something a bit different.
That's
I
better.
do kind of like the camera work. It being a bit shaky, it being, moving around a bit. It's almost like you're sitting at the table or you're trying to get like a closer view, you're trying to crowd in close, which is kind of cool. Yeah, it's to each their own.
No, I understand. As far as, again, the feel of table, again, I did feel like, we had enough hands intermixed that we could feel like how each player was doing at the table.
Hmm.
So that was a positive because some foul tables, it's like we see only like, half a table plays the hand that they're busted out in, and then maybe the other players have a few more hands together. So we had again a lot of hands where each player could at least contribute to the overall narrative. And personally, looking back at Gus Hansen, I think he played okay. I don't think he played amazing. I didn't think he played horrible. I think he played okay. But he did make a lot of hands in this one. And obviously, when you win the whole thing, you have to make hands. And heads up play, going on all the way to heads up play. It's only two hands from the heads up play by that point, which
Hmm.
normally I'd call it a negative. But considering that we got to see a good number of hands overall, not as big a deal than say if we only had like a 45-minute episode and you kind of want to see a lot of everybody. So I didn't mind that as much, but again, I still think that it's fun to see these guys play, even if the action is forgettable. But also, in the context of a brand new or different brand of poker to be watching in the first place.
Yeah, and obviously it's just kind of a matter of luck. I mean, if the short stacks don't really get anything going and the big stack manages to keep their stack, then you're just not going to have a super interesting episode. But at least, again, it's a good sort of introduction and base level to what the WPT was. And I'm sure, again, somebody watching this in '02 would have been, at least intrigued, if not super entertained at what the WPT was going to bring.
Which gets us to season two of the WPT, '03 to '04. And it was really watching this episode where my notes sort of became more organized. And I was having two sections really. I was having the comparison section where I compared it to the previous seasons, and I had the poker action in a separate section. So I was really able to kind of have my
Hmm.
thoughts be more concise. And so as far as how the season two differs from season one, I'd argue it's a bit better. It's
Hmm.
a little bit less clutter. It's not, it's still a lot of graphics and things popping up here, but it felt marginally better. It'll get better over time too. The intro was fairly similar. The crew obviously is the same. The camera felt maybe like 20% less shaky
Hmm.
compared to season one. The graphics being a little bit different, but we still had the chip counts pretty regularly featured. The lingo was pretty similar. Those poker ads for the site still there. And we actually had the whole cam referred to as WPT cam, which is a little bit
Mhm.
different. I mean, they tend to name things sometimes, and sort of stop naming it later on. And rather than having that sort of generic clip video for the rules, we have our old boy Lou Diamond Phillips does the rule video instead.
Yeah, and it's also it's kind of cheesy still, but it's a little bit more endearing, I guess. He says this line like turn over your cards, see who wins, and I hope it's me. And I'm like, it's cheesy, but I kind of like it a bit better. It's nicer to have somebody talking to being there talking to the camera instead of just a voiceover.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean the setup again is, I still don't really like how the final table looks. I think the lights are a bit too bright and artificial. You compare it to the WSOP where it's a bit darker, it's a bit more like, you've walked into this sort of unseemly casino and it's a bit sleeker over there. And also that this is, after but most of the tournament has been done. This is the final table versus, Ben and I have both been in Vegas. We saw the featured table. There's other tables in that room. You can kind of like walk up to the featured table from the other tables versus, there's an artificial quality to it being delayed and being in this like random room somewhere in the casino that, is like for private events that isn't necessarily a dedicated poker room. But not enough to take me out of the experience of watching it, but still just like it just feels tacky and off to me. And again, just the applause in the background, the audience who, just doesn't seem to really be reacting to the action, but you still put in this crowd noise. I mean, every now and again, starting in season two, it'll start to cut to somebody in the crowd and be like, that's, Paul Phillips's dad, that's, Chip Jett's mother or whatever. But they only do that on occasion. So it just leaves me to wonder, like, is the rest of the crowd just random people who are, background extras paid to watch this? It just feels a little off to me.
Other changes, we had a bit more of sort of like, content from outside the poker room. So we had these things called Poker in Hollywood, where we have Vince and Mike driving around and getting really short bits. Like I swear, like 20 seconds maybe. They barely get like to say one sentence apiece. And this first episode takes place in the Bicycle Casino in Hollywood. So I imagine they would have done shots like this in all the locations around the country that they went to. But again, really strange. And they do a couple of these, but again, they're in like we're the type that they would film in this like sort of car, this like fancy car on the street somewhere. And they do like maybe like two of these bits or maybe three per episode probably. But they're just so short. I'd rather just combine those all into one dedicated like 1 minute long clip to give us a little bit something to get to watch here. It's gone as soon as it starts. And then Shayna gets this thing called the poker corner, where it's kind of like a chance to focus on like one poker term, topic, lingo. Again, kind of like the Nets segment where it's like talk about like bad beats or talk about poke pot odds. Again, I didn't mind that one maybe as much. Again, it was very derivative of a lot of those segments from the World Series of Poker. But this I guess probably predates it anyway. And at least they got rid of those sort of 30-minute on the dot like recap montages from those episodes. And then one thing I liked, but unfortunately it's very brief also, is the out on the bubble bit where we see who was
Yeah.
eliminated in seventh place before the final table. And again, I like that idea. I like seeing it because it lets you know more about the rest of the tournament, but it's again very brief.
Yeah, it is too brief. I mean, they do occasionally in some of these interview segments like splice in a clip shot before the final table of like a player at at their table. So they did shoot at least some footage before the final table. And it would have been nice to have seen in these interview segments, this is how my tournament went. On day one, I was a short stack, but then on day two, I managed to chip up. The interview segments are just way too short. And it's a shame because in this episode, I think, Paul Phillips is a really interesting guy. He's this sort of online player and he even says $500,000, which is the top price, is not going to change my life, which is just kind of a strange thing to say. TJ Cloutier is a very fascinating guy. Mel Judah, I think, is a fascinating guy. He used to be a ladies' hairdresser and now he's a professional poker player. There's some interesting stories here, but the interview segments, they often get like three sentences at the most, and it's very quick and very fast edited, and then it's on to the action. So it would have been nice if just at least 30 seconds of each of these guys talking about their lives and what brought them to this tournament.
Also, I think I misspoke earlier because I mentioned the weird display of like two players at 1v1.
Mhm.
That kind of begins in this season actually with the weird music, as it'll show like the start of hand chip stacks during the middle of a hand. But it's like I think it's more important to know how much they have behind at that point. Like if like I guess that's one's all in, so it's one thing. But I feel like it's more useful to know how much they have behind, and also having the pot size be showed concurrently, so you sort of put it all together. And again, that weird music will be there during those weird points. Then it'll just cut away, like it'll go back to normal. Like it didn't really add much at all. It was just felt kind of like, oh, we'll try it out and see if it works, and it didn't work.
Yeah, that music reminded me of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, when they're like in the $250,000 question, that dun, 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 like that music. It's just very
Mhm.
strange. It works on Millionaire because it adds sort of a foreboding quality. You don't know what the player is, going to answer for their question. But here yeah, it just doesn't really work. The music thread isn't super impressive. It's trying to be like upbeat and like, oh yeah, we're going on the World Poker Tour. This is a prestigious poker event, but it just comes off as inauthentic. The WSOP music's a lot more interesting.
There was also would kind of be a recurring thing for each season going forward. There'd be like an ending montage once the game was over, showing
Mhm.
each player's finishing place, their prize money, and then it would tie into the signing out at the very end. I was okay with that because in case you missed something or you wanted to be reminded of how much money somebody won, that wasn't terrible. It's pretty quick. They do return with the whole poker quiz bits, which again doesn't last much longer beyond this season naturally, which is probably better. So that's kind of lame personally. And they also had something called the tips from a pro, which again is kind of like a let's ask somebody what you would do in this situation, and they tell you again meant to be sort of that educating the audience type bit, which really again after '04 I feel like that kind of stopped being a thing in poker television because by then they would assume the audience would know enough where they wouldn't benefit from such a segment. And then also something kind of lame ultimately was the WPT critical replay
Right.
where like after a big hand they would sort of break down the hand that just happened and really not really add much because again they're commenting on the hand as it's happening, so when you go back to the hand you just saw there's not too much more to add at that point.
Yeah, they usually don't add anything at all. They usually just repeat what they just said in, slightly different tones of voice. Yeah, I mean the commentary thread is mainly just, Farzad Banyadi bets 50,000 and now, TJ Cloutier raises to 100,000. I mean, every now and again, Sexton or Vince Van Patten will make some sort of comment like, I don't like this or I like this. But for the most part, the commentary just kind of goes over what happened. One thing that I thought going into this that Vince Van Patten was like the funny one that he would like make jokes or something like Joe Stapleton, but he didn't really do that. They didn't really like, do these like tacky jokes, which I appreciate. But it just kind of felt like, oh, it's just all right. You bet 50,000, now he folds, whoop-de-doo, and then it's on to the next hand. And the commentary just doesn't really bring much out.
I mean, it felt very superlative. Like, oh, what an amazing player right here. He had, two thighs in the hole and he gets him to fold A7. Like, oh my God. Like, and again, I just was not impressed by the commentary. And while I'm not saying I can do much better, I
Hmm.
just feel like, again, it felt just kind of too elementary overall. And, too superlative, too overblown, too dramatic. Like, oh, what a play. Like, even in this foul table here, so we have Phil Locke making a four-bet shove of ace jack, and the Brooks like, "Oh my God, what a play! What a play!" It's like, well, it's he's going crazy with ace jack. I mean, it's not like that crazy a play. It's six-handed. Ace jack's still a pretty good hand, even facing a three-bet sometimes. So I don't know. Again, so superlative at times. Um, what other I felt like again this was after having watched one episode and now into episode two of this. This is when the commentary you're getting into the habits of how they talk and how they and what they say. Again, you could probably like remove the names from and like, I guess the hand values and sort of like Mad Libs them into other episodes and probably come across, you probably wouldn't be able to tell a difference because like I don't feel like if you compare '02 to '07 they were all that different as far as their poker analysis.
Yeah, the poker analysis wasn't at all very different. Maybe there's like a little bit more sort of comedic banter as the show goes on, but not much of one. And, it's not really like Vince and Mike have like a whole lot of chemistry with each other. Like Lon and Norm, I think, do have chemistry with each other. There's sort of a back and forth and a rapport between the two of them. I don't really understand why it's these two specific guys talking about it, beside, Mike having some poker credentials and then Vince Van Patten being some sort of actor or celebrity. I've never seen him in any movies. But again, like they're not bad guys or anything. That the commentary is not. It doesn't drive me away from watching the WPT, but it doesn't encourage me to watch more. I mean, I saw people in the comments being like, Mike Sexton, you're a legend. I love your commentary so much, and I think Lana and Norm are better.
I agree. And also, there's no like ever like a third member guest star, or there's never like
Hmm.
like the floor host never gets in on the action ever like that. Unfortunately, she does do exit interviews, which is a regular feature in a lot of poker broadcasts. But again, these often are again. maybe a little bit longer than some of the interview bits, but just not long enough to really give us a great idea of their thought process in totality.
Yeah.
And also another thing that they kind of added in with Shayna Hyatt was this weird sort of like end montage where it's like over the end credits spliced with like Vince and Mike sound bits where it's like almost like not quite a blooper reel, but not quite not a blooper reel. It's like a really weird choice. I mean, we only seen one of them obviously for the first episode of that season, but I was very confused by that bit.
Yeah, it was very strange. Like she's just making weird faces, like flubbing lines or whatever. She's like standing out in front of different casinos. Like this is the first episode. Like maybe as like the last episode of the season, you can kind of do something like this. Is like, oh, remember this casino, remember that. But no, this is like the first episode. It's very odd.
Yeah. And so, as far as the actual poker play, so again, we have Mel Judah, Chip Jet, Farzad Banyadi. I'm Fred, though. I never heard of that
Yeah.
name before. Phil Locke, the Unabomber, TJ Cloutier, and Paul Phillips. And again, Phillips has about double what Cloutier had in second place. So again, you'd expect him to do pretty well, and he does do pretty well. Whereas Chip Jet was actually at Adam Grosak's table in 2021. I want to say day two or day three. Oh, day three. I think day three it was. Yeah. And I remember looking him up for him to, and I was like, oh, that's the guy you want to look out for. So it's kind of fun to see him here, even with a short stack. And one of the, again, we discussed, poker chips during our early podcast days, the evolution. And the weirdest thing, they did not color up the chips in this table for the longest time. Like they did not
Yeah.
have 5K chips. 5K chips, which is not even a crazy denomination. Like they didn't have the 5K chips until the like 80% into this final tables broadcast. And so you're talking about, the opening level here is 2.5K and 5K. And so it just makes sense to have, the 5K chips by then, if not even earlier. And so they have these just mountains of chips, which I'm not against having mountains of chips, but at the same time, you also don't want to. It's when I have like if they had the 100K chips in, that'd be a reason why I'd be complaining. But for this case, in this one, didn't make sense.
Yeah, it was kind of weird. Yeah, the chips themselves look, okay. There's nothing remarkable about them throughout. I do kind of like seeing mountains of chips. It's fun just seeing chip sprawls, especially compared to, players that don't have as many chips. It's just that dichotomy is kind of interesting, but nothing really to write home about.
Yeah, and then again, the fact that this season had Lito and Phillips tells us that, again that poker primer DVD kind of comes in this broadcast window of this show. Whereas I guess as far as the poker here, Paul kind of has control of the table. Supposedly, like a lot of times they'll say, "Oh, he's been controlling this table, he's table captain." But we didn't really see him play too many hands in the first half of the episode. I mean, he makes it to the heads up, which is it's good because not all the final table chip leaders to start off with would get to the final two. So good for him for again. So it was a pretty talented field actually,
Mhm.
holding up that long. But as far as the hand here, I did have a good number of notes about this hand happened here. We did learn about TJ Cloutier having a heart attack while playing. That was kind of a good little interview bit to learn about that. And again, that one had a little bit lot more time than the average one did. So I'm glad they were able to show us that story. But
Mhm.
um, there was a lot of big folds by Paul for the most part that were the wrong folds, but
Mhm.
which some folks might say he's horrible. But when you have a big chip lead and you think that you don't want to give away a chance at that lead, it kind of makes sense if you're over the chip leader to not take a chance like that if you're trying to bunker down for a little bit longer.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, yeah, he makes a couple of, sort of bad plays toward the end, and particularly in the last 10, he makes a bad call, straight over straight, which is, always kind of fun to see. But, I think he did okay. He didn't put himself at too much risk for most of the final table. There's sort of, I found this final table a lot more interesting than the first one. I mean, Phil Lock is always a lot of fun, to see him jumping out of his chair and covering his face up and all that. But TJ Cloutier definitely got the sort of like, hometown favorite treatment. Like they were really trying to play up on the coverage. Like everybody loves him. There's a whole montage like halfway through the episode of like TJ Cloutier, he's such a badass. He's so cool. And he does fine. I mean, I don't think he does anything, any big moves, anything super special, but he manages to get his stack in there, kind of goes up, goes down, but manages to kind of bob and weave. And does not make it to heads up, unfortunately, but does okay.
Yeah, I felt that Shayna definitely got a lot more use in this season than the first season or any time. Like even Kara Scott at her most used in on ESPN was far less than how Shayna was used. So I'm happy for that because again I feel like with poker being such a male dominated sport, I think it's important to give everybody on the crew a fair share of screen time. And you mentioned that final hand. That was actually, a pretty crazy hand because it was checked down to the river, and then Mel overbet shoves the river, and Paul just. I mean, again, it's a weird spot because you're basically either chopping or you're dead, and so and when it's checked down to the river, the pot's small enough where I think you can just fold almost every single time, and it's probably the right move because. It's gonna if there had been like a bet on the flop and on the turn, then I could see, why you'd want to not give away that many chips for free. But that's just me personally.
Yeah, and as Paul is kind of deliberating, he actually says that he has a straight, which Sexton brouhahas over. It's like, that's illegal. Oh my God, you shouldn't say that, which it's just kind of funny thinking about JB Gold in a couple years. I think heads up, I think that's okay. That actually happened also before that Paul said that he had top pair and Sexton's like, that's illegal. I think when you're heads up, you can talk about, what's in your hand. I think that's okay, especially if the other player isn't offended by it, which Judah's a professional. He's not gonna, give away the value of his hand in that spot. I think
Also, when you're down to the final two of the tournament, that's even more okay. Like heads up, like literally heads up for the whole thing. It's one thing if you have other players on the table and there's like collusion. Oh, you're trying to, whatever. But when it's down to the final two, there's no collusion at that point. So yeah, that makes sense to me. And again, heads up content is only two hands again, and so again, at least they aren't doing the old ESPN formula of show the loser winning the first hand and then having the winner win the next hand. But I guess when heads up is relatively short, you can only do so much of the content you have. Not to mention, again, we're not actually shown how many hands are skipped in between in the edit. A lot of times there are hands shown in consecutive order, and other times the editing makes you think that this is just like sort of one hand to the next hand. It's like they're not like, oh, it's been an hour later, now let's see what happens. There's no montage like, oh, this happened in between here, and now we're moving on to the, you know, it's trying to fool you into thinking that this is all continuous.
Yeah, I mean, again, you can kind of look at the chip stack and kind of guess like, oh, this guy just lost 100,000 chips, but he didn't play the previous hand, so clearly they've edited some hands out. I mean, for the most part, yeah, they do a pretty good job of showing the big hands. Like, Judah at one point is down three-handed. It looks like it's going to be Phillips versus Cleday. He manages to chip up. I think they do a good job showing his progression throughout. I mean, he was fifth in chips to start the final table, and he managed to win. So, I mean, that was a pretty good comeback for him. And I think they showed him well and showed his character well. So that's sort of another thing that, I liked about this episode, that they did manage to show that progression well enough without too many skips.
Not to mention, one nice thing about this entire program entirely is that for the most part, the short stack is not always the first one out, and the
Right.
chip winner and the top two aren't the final two usually. Like there's usually a fair amount of letdowns or surprises where it's not just like down the list. Oh, chip winner was first, second place got second, third place got third. There's a good amount of shakeups there, even if it's only one or two spots per final table. So that's also less cliche or predictable as far as the final outcome. And so, and also one more note I had on this entire foul table was just a lot of like folding and showing, which
Yeah.
is kind of funny. I mean, obviously this is not on like a live feed, so it's not like they're going to know the hand like 10 minutes later, 15 minutes later. But I thought it's a pretty weak play to be like, I folded and like giving your final table as free information is never ideal if you ask me. And it's one thing to like show a bluff or like to show your hand after if no one's called you, like, oh, I had a real flush. But to show a hand when you're folding, I just think is never a good move.
Yeah, it is kind of a strange move. And I mean, to do that like every once in a while to kind of like throw somebody off their game, I can understand that. Or like, I'll show if you show, if there's some sort of deal that's made, that's okay. But yeah, that was very odd to see.
And again, I did write in my notes. I kind of like the poker action a bit more in season one than season two, but I thought the ending was arguably one of the better surprise endings of a final table I've seen in a while.
Mhm.
And so again, it was, and again they made a few production things that I think were a little bit better or a bit more interesting. So they're pretty close though.
Yeah.
Whereas season three, this is now the first season of the WPT to air after the Moneymaker year on ESPN, and so again, that was represented in having a bit bigger field for the events. This is the Mirage Poker Showdown, which would actually be the first event for the next couple of seasons for the broadcast of the WPT. This had 281 players, a 4 day long tournament. So again, the main event was again kind of in that ballpark too. It was, as
Mhm.
far as how many days, with the structure being a little bit bigger, I mean a little bit fast and more aggressive, I guess. That's probably why you have a similar runtime. the introduction to the WPT now a bit fancier, but kind of almost more ominous
Yeah.
compared to the first couple of seasons. Again, still the same crew at this point, with some slight graphical updates. We had new things on screen like poker tip graphics, like facts about this hand, like mid hand, like this player has like 8 outs to make a straight, or they're if they call this, they'll only have half of their chips left or whatever. It's also called like a hand update. So again, kind of like a pop-up ad on the middle of a hand to give you more information about it. And this was that season that we mentioned earlier that kind of had that like almost like interaction between the booth and the players like
Right.
mid-hand. It was kind of odd. And otherwise, pretty similar structure. Maybe fewer like those like graphical things overall, but the poker corner and the poker quiz and the replay do return in the season as well, though.
Yeah, I mean, there's not too many differences, little touch-ups here and there. I'm not quite sure what the budget was, per episode or per season for this. I wonder if the budget went up after, the Moneymaker year or not. But yeah, we have at this table Scotty Nguyen being the chip leader again with 2 times the second place stack, with Ellie Lesra being in second, Gabe Kaplan being in third, Lead Watkinson, who made the final table at the main event in '07, in fourth place, John Jawanda, and then Jim Meehan last. So again, like a pretty good final table. I mean, they got like a pretty good selection of players in here. Um, I've never heard of Jim Meehan before, but obviously the other 5 guys I had. So again, I had no idea who won this, and I was looking at Scotty to win, and I'm like, oh, okay, well, they kind of played up before in season one. He started out as a big stack and busted in six, and they play it up sort of to begin here that like, he keeps not quite being able to seal the deal with the WPT. He keeps making final tables but not making. I'm like, okay, he's got a good chip lead. Surely he'll do well here. So that was my expectation going into this. Otherwise, I had no idea about the results.
Yeah, and with this event again, the Mirage. Again, even though these are events that are different casinos, you can't really be like, oh, this is definitely the Mirage. This is definitely the Bellagio.
Mhm.
Again, the table is pretty similar looking, so it's not like you could tell from the background, oh, this is definitely like part of the Mirage in the background here. So that's not really all that important. And again, usually each episode has one dedicated sort of ad spot per the casino, and in this case, the Mirage has the Mirage Girls when they bring out the money for the final two, which. I guess the outfit they wear is different year to year, but otherwise that's the same kind of presentation they do at the main event where they wheel out the money. The fake bricks of cash that are like, fake money or like $1 bills, with $100 on the front or whatever, but that we mentioned before, kind of whatever. And then one big difference in season three here is the beer plug at the very end. It's like the Amber Bock, like final beer toast ceremony where Mike says, may your cards be live, or your flushes or your hands be monster and your flushes be live, whatever. That
May
whole.
all your cards be alive and all your pots be monsters.
Excuse me, sorry, I don't know, whatever the quote is. And I've literally never heard of the beer brand Amber Bock. Like before this, after this, I mean, I don't drink, so I guess that's part of it. But again, it's just weird how they have all these obscure beers. They can't just get like an actual beer company to sponsor poker. It's the funniest thing.
Yeah, and it's also, I thought it kind of weird that like Vince and Mike come out and have beers. The first place person has a beer. The second place person has a beer. Like 20 people get beers. And you can tell like the second place finisher like is usually pretty disappointed. Like they want to go. And yet they're there like in front of the camera holding a beer. It's very strange.
Yeah, I agree there. And with Ellie Lesra, they actually call me Eli instead of Ellie,
Yeah.
which is weird because I think by this point he had been on, probably on one of the main event final tables or the WSP final tables at this point. So, I don't know. It's weird that they didn't get the name right. Kind of remind me of how Farzad Banyadi was called Fred. I guess they just stick to a nickname and go with it. Again, Sky Win has this big chip lead. He has over 100 big blinds when the table begins. He makes a pretty bad play calling off of ace nine when Joanna has ace jack, which leads to a Joanna double. And that kind of spoke to me like a lot of the hands in these ballot tables boil down to a dominate ace or like a coin flip.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of pair over pairs. There's or like at least when it comes to pre-flop all ins, which is funny. But so again, it speaks to how when you're the aggressor when you have those weak middling aces, you want to be the one that puts in that bet. And that is a tip that Sexton does name drop a lot as far as being the first aggressor is a big advantage in a hand.
Yeah, I've noticed that a lot. There were a lot of sort of misplayings and overplayings of middling aces like ace nine or even ace jack in spots where somebody like three or four bets all in. Like ace jack really shrinks in a spot like that. A lot of those sort of misplays. But yeah, there's some, queens versus ace kings in there. There is every now and again, like eights versus queens, something like that. And like the eights will flop a set or the queens will turn a set or something like that. But yeah, for the most part, I mean, a lot of these hands there's a number of raise and takes it. They both call, get to a flop, somebody leads out and then folds. There's a good mixture of those hands. And I don't mind some of those hands in the coverage because they make the coverage feel a bit more realistic. So it's nice to kind of see that variety in this.
Yeah, I did like the establishment of the narrative of Sky Wins trying to close out one title for the WPT after a few
Mhm.
failures. I think that gave the first half of this table a good sort of structure. Just can he pull it off finally? He doesn't. The cards don't go his way. He goes from 2 million to out in fifth place.
Mhm.
He does his best. It's not quite as bad a blow as his '07 main event performance is, but I mean, it's probably up there because I've only seen him in so many events. So it's probably, top three of his biggest, letdowns in poker.
Yeah, and also in this first half of the episode, I mentioned how in the previous episode, TJ Cloutier was kind of like the hometown favorite. They really tried to make Gabe Kaplan the sort of like hometown favorite. They pipe in a lot of applause as he wins hands and he's talking to Vince Van Patten supposedly and all that. I like Gabe Kaplan fine, like no problem, but it's just kind of funny to hear him hype up, especially because he doesn't really do a whole lot during the first half of the episode. He does finish in third place starting out in third place. All right, so he held his own okay. But like I don't really get a good sense of how he is as a poker player. Seems like a nice guy, but I don't really know how he is as a strategist.
But also, I mean, getting third when you were third to begin was good, but when the chip leader is blowing up and giving away chips, and you're not, getting some of those chips to, leapfrog, then that means that someone below you leapfrogged you, and so you could argue that's also, a negative, I guess.
Hmm.
Um, this episode's poker corner was about mirages in poker because they're playing at the Mirage, like creating illusion of bluff. So it's kind of a cringeworthy pun, but again, I guess I've seen worse bits in these episodes than that.
Yeah, there's like some weird shot of Chris Ferguson like out in the desert and he's like fading away or whatever. Like that was just kind of strange. They talked a little bit about how like mirages can be body language or whatever, but again, the segments are just too short, so you just don't really have enough time to hear for sure like these concepts, which are kind of interesting, and they're certainly better than poker lingo just flashing up on the screen. It's just
And,
odd.
and then there was a bit called Up All Night where it's about like how well someone slept before the night before, which I think is not a bad one because, it's like some players have trouble falling asleep. Some just are out like a light. Some are up drinking and partying. Oh, I'm at the final table and then they don't sleep at all. I guess it's not something that I wouldn't be against hearing about for each final table going forward.
Yeah, and they also had a little bit where like they asked the players if they'd seen Welcome Back, Kotter, which is the sitcom that Gabe Kaplan did. And they're like, no, we've never heard of it. I thought that was kind of cute.
Yeah, so again, I mean, maybe a bit better on the interview stuff or the side bits in this episode than the other ones.
Hmm.
It was funny how this final table was broken into two parts on YouTube, whereas the YouTuber had it like part one of two, part two of two, and so it made me think that maybe this was like sort of two separate 1 hour chunks on TV. Not the case. It's just kind of how it was on YouTube actually. It was really around this time, this episode, where the commentary took an extra level of annoyance to me, where it's like it's always this weird, like hush, intense sort of discussion, like here he is, he's got vibes. What's he gonna do? Oh my God! Like, what's he? It just really was repetitive, and it didn't feel like they were mixing things up as far as how they were announcing things.
Yeah, again, as I mentioned, I mean, it's basically just saying what the players are doing, and then maybe like every 10 hands, you'll get one comment from Sexton, like, I like this play, or oh, I really don't like this
What a
play.
call! What a call that was with a top pair on a double paired board. Like, I mean, come on.
Yeah, I mean, but they'll say like, I like this play, I don't like this play, what a call, and they won't exposit on it. They won't be like, this is an incredible call because he took advantage of the moment, or he's manipulating his table image, something like that. They'll just say, what a call, and that's it. Yeah, I mean, the whispering is reminds me of golf. Where it kind of makes it makes sense on a golf course. You have to whisper because you don't want to screw up the player who's playing golf, and you're trying to make it seem live. I understand that, but it is again just I've said this word before at the WPT. It just is tacky. It's just tacky.
It's kind of funny that we have both Lee Walkinson and Scully to win, who made, top 11 runs in the main event in '07 because of that, corollary. And it actually is a good segue to something I wanted to bring up at some point today was that we had a couple of recent comments on our podcast on the Philip Hilm interview
Hmm.
episode, which, obviously talks about Sky and Win a little bit and indirectly Lee Watkinson. And so we had a guy comment, this YouTube name is Paul Lilly LW3HF. He said, "This is a shame this doesn't have more views in relation to the Philip Hilm episode." And then I said, "Oh, thank you for the comment. We had a blast talking to our guest." He said, "I'd love to hear more of a guest of this type who's made it deeper in older main events. It's great insight and very interesting." And so we thank you very much, Paul Lilly, for those comments. And again, I'm always reaching out in here and there to get more of those sort of old school interviewees. And so I'm looking forward to maybe finding somebody else soon. And he also commented on the Raymer interview, back for more, great listen. So again, thank you very much for watching our interview videos. Again, I think our interviews are some of our best content on our channel. So I think that people should, get those to go viral because we have so much fun with those talks, and I hope to do more.
Yeah, absolutely. And these early main event guys, were really just interesting people, right? I mean, they had their own lives before they came to poker. They became these weird sorts of celebrities during it. I mean, all the guys at this final table, I thought, were just really personable. Gabe Kaplan maybe has like a bit of a sort of, I don't know, like weird sort of father humor. His jokes are a bit tacky, but I like them. Elliot Lesser, I've always really liked. He just seemed like a really cool guy. I like the little things. There's one point where there's people in the crowd who are chanting Lee, 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 like trying to hype him up, and then Elliot Lesser like stands up and like points at himself as though they're chanting about him. I thought that was kind of cute. And Sky, one's always fun to watch. So, thank you for the comments. It's great to that these guys can get a little bit of attention and a bit of praise. And Philip Pilm was great to talk to. So hopefully he's watching this and is doing awesome.
Yeah, and I will say this that we finally get a pretty meaty heads up battle
Mhm.
in this final table compared to the last couple of final tables, where we get about a good like 19-ish minutes of episode is just for the heads up stuff. And Lee Walkinson has like a 2.5 to 1 chip lead is about 4 million versus 1.7 million with the blinds at 40K, 80K, and so not super deep, but still you could lose a few hands and still be okay. But Ellie just kind of runs him over heads up. He
Yeah.
wins the first four hands that are shown. And then from there, Lee just makes a few pretty bad mistakes and ends up making a very bizarre limp shove of 5-4 suited. Again, when Elliot was has ace queen, that again the percentages pre-flop are not terrible. Like it reminded me of the of a hand with what's her name? Oh my God, I forget her name, but it reminded me of a different hand where it was like ace king against 5-3 suited, and it was like 60 or like 58-42. It's not
Hmm.
terrible, but at the same time, it's 5-4, it's five high pre-flop. I mean, don't do it.
Yeah, I think Sexton said like, "Oh, it's two live cards." Well, yeah, it's two live cards, but you really want to put in all your chips, you know, with that hand when you're playing for $1 million. I mean, I think you'd want to wait for a better spot, especially, Lee Watkinson is somebody who has some skill. I mean, he did okay for himself during this final table. Obviously, he made his main event run in 2007. Like, if you feel you have a decent amount of skill, why do you want to take a risk with something like that? It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you put somebody on a weekend, like, oh, you limp shot, you're limp, so they feign wins. But I feel like people limp much more to trap than to just to limp. At least
Yeah.
I mean, I can't speak to the mid 2000s, but I feel like you need to be. It's almost like at worst case, it's like half and half. Like half time it's a trap, half time it's not a trap. So I don't know. I don't like to play, and it obviously works out for Elliot Resra. He takes over $1 million, the biggest prize up to this point, at least for the episodes that we've watched. And again, I thought that Lee played very well up until heads up, and just kind of
Mhm.
fell apart. And again, it wasn't quite as one-sided as at like main event Europe that we had like 10 hands in a row go one way. He won like I think like one hand in the edit here, which is better than zero, but it was still pretty gross.
Yeah.
Which gets us now, I guess, to season four, which was the
Mhm.
'05 to '06. And again, once again, this was at the Mirage, it's called, the Mirage Poker Showdown. It did feel like that you had a few more cameras in this production. Maybe this is where the budget increases might probably came in, where you had more angles or more spots to show stuff. Graphics a little bit different, a little bit cleaner, I felt, like less blurry and less, sort of cluttered. And again, that shaky camera definitely a bit more honed in, especially from this point going forward.
Yeah, they do a couple little editing tricks, like they introduce like two players at a time to begin and show us what their chip counts are, and try to have it be like, here are the two professionals, here are the two sort of semi-professionals, here are the two amateurs. Um, a couple little graphical changes. There's no more Shauna Hyatt. Shauna Hyatt left in between seasons 3 and 4. The woman, I can't remember what Courtney something. I've never heard of
Friel,
her
Courtney
before.
Friel.
Courtney Friel, never heard of her before or since. I think she's some television anchor in Los Angeles. She's okay. I mean, basically, the same as Shauna Hyatt. She kind of just, gives little interviews, does a little like poker corner and talk, but again, these interviews are just too short. It's nice that they're there, but they're just a little bit too abbreviated to be really effective. But she's okay. She's nothing special.
And the whole cam is renamed the Budweiser whole cam,
Hmm.
which okay, they I think that's definitely a more mainstream beer product placement, but then it's still Amber Bock at the end for the end toast. So it makes you wonder if maybe they were locked in for like a 2-year contract or something like that. They couldn't do the Budweiser toast at the end. I don't know. And unfortunately, one of the bits I really enjoyed in season three, the on the bubble thing, is now just a graphic at the bottom of the screen saying like who went out in seventh place, which is a shame because again, it's kind of the Bubble Boys. That's also one of the most fun parts of the main event is seeing who the Bellboy will be. So, uh,
Yeah.
it's nice to see like a picture of who it was if you don't know who the name was just by the name. Uh, so with this final table, I was less familiar with this table than the last couple. I didn't know who Mark Ellerby was, or
Mhm.
Eugene Todd, or Chris Bell, and not really Keto Fame either. So really, I knew Gavin Smith and Ted Forrest, and that was it.
Yeah, and also this final table, the chip stacks are, relatively even. Keto Fam is the chip leader at 1.76 million. Chris Bell's in second at 1.4. So I mean, 300,000 still a decent lead, but it's not like, he was the runaway chip leader. Mark Albert is the short second at 353K, but he still has a bit of maneuverability. So it's a bit more even this time. Again, just kind of like a random luck of the draw thing, but it's interesting that it kind of bucks the pattern.
Yeah, and this was another one of those times where they mentioned like it's the pros up against the amateurs. And unfortunately, the amateurs go out first, one and two. So it's not nearly as fun when you have like one amateur mixing it up with the veterans up in there. But even though this was the table that I was the least familiar with, I've got to say it was probably the most memorable poker up until this point of this rewatch. Because of the table talk, the antics, and sort of this like sort of near rule breaking of some of the antics on display here, it definitely stood to me as the most memorable.
Yeah, it definitely was. And there's also an interesting thing in one of these early hands that they showed what the turn and river cards would have been, which I thought was they did that occasionally at the WSOP, like the rabbit cam, but it would usually just be the river. It wouldn't usually be the turn and the river, which I thought was kind of interesting. Just like a little thing to note. Yeah, I thought the poker action was very interesting. Gavin Smith, I know of, but I didn't know Super Bowl. Like he comes off very well, I think, in this episode. Pretty decent player, and also just kind of like a fun guy to have at the table. Rest in peace, of course. Seemed to be like a really well loved guy too, which is a shame.
Yeah, and again with this tournament, with the buy-in being 10K, again, still that main event prize pool. They'll stay at 10K until the very end, actually, which is kind of funny. The top prize being $1.13 million. So this is the biggest prize I think so far for the first event of the WPT. Obviously, the championship is probably bigger. And you have to wonder if maybe like that big prize pool, top heavy prize pool got in the minds of the amateurs on display here because they really, they go all in. The first two bust outs are basically shoves drawing dead pretty much and out in quick fashion. It was pretty embarrassing.
Yeah, Mark Ellerby is the first one to go. He's the short stack, so it kind of makes sense. But he shoves with Jack 10, missing the flop when Keto Fam has a set of fives. Yeah, pretty embarrassing, I think.
And then later on, Eugene calls off dead when Gavin Smith has a full house, and so he's gone in fifth. And so, again, there are certain ways in poker I would just not want to be knocked out, and that's one of them. Like if I have to blend into like five big blinds and shove like ace five and bust to king queen, so be it. But there's just no way I'm going to call off. I'm going to call off with when I suspect my opponent's got a full house. Just not happening.
Yeah, and also the payouts between sixth and fifth place, just $31,000. I mean, it's such a small jump. I mean, it just doesn't feel rewarding to get fifth place. So to go out in that spot, I mean, it's just silly.
No, I'm glad you mentioned the payout numbers because something I took annoyance with. It's a small thing, but if a prize for like sixth place was like $100,999, they'll
Hmm.
call it $100,000. They won't call it. They will never round up when like Mike like not name drops the prize number. He'll never round
Yeah.
up to the nearest thousand. So it's like just round up to the nearest thousand, please. Just do it to me, do it for me, please. The mathematician in me is like, get that right.
Yeah, I always find it a bit silly. It's like $137,223. Like, why not just make it $137,200? Why the 223? Like, what's that really going to do?
I agree. And so probably the most memorable hand though from this early action was mid-hand, Keto Fam goes to his friend in the crowd and takes some sunglasses and like a power move. And it actually convinces Gavin Smith to fold the best hand. So that was actually kind of amusing. Again, this is one of those hands that put this poker in the top spot in my rankings for the first four seasons.
Yeah, they did like a little fist bump, don't they? Like that was really funny. I think they even said like you can't really go to the rail, but he did it anyway, which I thought was funny.
Yeah, and again, so it's these sort of things here, and all the while, Eugene Todd, he definitely came across to me as the most annoying of the players here, the most amateurish, just with his antics. I mean, I was kind of happy to see him out in fifth, to be honest, but nonetheless, that was just sort of, he just didn't impress me at all. Like I understand that you can't, it's a lot of pressure under the big lights or on TV, but hold yourself a bit better than that, please.
Yeah, he just seemed very nervous. I understand, like, if you're somebody who's not used to being under a spotlight, you have a bunch of cameras around you, you're under a bunch of bright lights, you're playing for a lot of money, that you can just come off as nervous. But yeah, like, some deep breaths, drink some water. If you got to get up and, pace to get some nervous energy, do that, and then just don't do weird hands. Like, just don't shove all in when you're in a bad spot.
And then as far as Keto Family is really pulling out all the stops in
Mhm.
this tournament. So later on, he has a hand against Ted Forrest where Ted has a set, and he kind of puts Ted in a tough spot. But in the process of doing so, he stands up from the table and walks around the table. And again, it felt like he had more like nervous energy vibes than like strong energy vibes. And I think that was a big reason why Ted makes the correct call and wins the hand. And again, I love the bet he put him in the first place when he was again it was a scary board for a set, but then he just kind of ruined it with his antics.
Yeah, I thought that was really weird. Like he got up and was like walking around the table. Like it's very strange. Take some deep breaths, look at a spot at the table and kind of just like focusing on that. Keep your face blank. That just strange.
Yeah, and then Keto ends up busting in fourth place, having been crippled from that loss. And it was a funny three-way hand where Ted Forrest kind of had he not bet into a dry pot or dry side pot in this case, Chris Bell would have won the hand instead of him. And so again, it was funny how with these huge pay jumps, how players just were not, following the rules of, you want to, check it down unless you have a big hand to knock out the other player.
Yeah, absolutely.
At that point, again, we're three-handed, and again, it's when the blinds get bigger and the tables get shorter, where a lot of the all-in calls and the back and forths usually take place. And this is, there's definitely some of that going on three-handed here. There was another time where this time Chris. Or Chris Bell, he shoves, gets up from the table, and again he does the opposite of Keto Fam, where he makes his hand look even stronger than it was than. But also he shouldn't have shoved there. He should have bet smaller, I think there. But nonetheless, again, an example of sort of table antics going wrong for a player.
Yeah, like he goes over to the rail. Like it's just very strange to see all this. Like maybe they're thinking, "Oh, I'm on television. I got to be goofy in order to be on TV." Maybe that's a factor in this. I remember Joe Hashim talking about how in '05 people were like jumping on tables and jumping on chairs trying to get people's attention. But I mean, there's other ways you can get attention that don't involve making yourself look like a clown, and just don't do that.
Otherwise, in this episode, really Courtney gets even less than Shayna did in past seasons to do, unfortunately, because it would be nice to have seen if she had a different style or a different take on poker than she did, but not the case. And there was an odd spot where she talked to Chris's like fans in the stands for all of like 2 seconds. Like it just didn't make sense for that bit to be so brief.
Yeah, I mean, they both mentioned that had formerly played the WPT, so it might have been kind of interesting to hear like, oh, I had this experience with Chris and we become good friends, but it's just like, yeah, we really like him. Woohoo, back to the action. It just doesn't work.
Yeah. And then as the table dies down, Chris goes out in third, busting in a flip to Gavin. And then with heads up, we only get again two hands of heads up, and the first one's a raise and take, unfortunately. So again, it's a brief bit. And again, with heads up, honestly, it's pretty impressive how many times we get a big pair up against like a big ace as the final hand of heads up play. And this happens, and so Gavin Smith does manage to close things out, taking the top prize. And again, I felt kind of sad because again, now that since he's passed away, I was happy to see him get this new win, a win that was like brand new to me, even though it was old news.
Yeah, and this was a spot where I mentioned earlier that I felt like players that were, misplaying ace jack, which again, I know is like a good hand heads up, but I mean, when Gavin shoves all in after you've raised, I mean, is he doing that with ace 10? Is he doing that with ace 9? Is he doing that with pocket fours? Like, I don't really think so. I think Ted could have gone away there. Yeah, as you mentioned, Gavin, again, seems like a really great guy. It was nice to see him win. He also became the WPT Player of the Year this year, so he kind of had that win as well, a bit more respectability to him. And just, really seemed like a nice guy. And, I'm sorry that he's no longer with us.
Yeah. But otherwise, again, still, a better episode of poker than the last couple. And so I thought we were, on a positive trajectory, which is kind of funny because we kind of thought that the '05 was kind of like the top year of
Yeah.
main event coverage. So again, something about '05 in the air that year was just, on point, I guess. As we get to season 5, again, we have the Mirage Poker Showdown, but the biggest field so far, up to 384 players
Hmm.
which again makes sense. Poker Boom is still going. The main event was growing in size, and I'm sure the WPT was also growing in size. You have probably more events and more players in those events, so it makes sense. But there still was a good number of changes here compared to past seasons. Again, the intro redone, which is fine. I'm not against changing the intro up, keep things fresh here. Again, the chip count and the table graphics are a little bit different now. It's the Cadillac chip count. So again, they have a few ad placements there. And once again, we have a brand new host on the floor here, Sabina Gadecki, who gets even less to do than Courtney and Shayna before her did, which is unfortunate because again, it's nice to just kind of see they all hold themselves with the microphone in hand.
Yeah, and there's also this new sort of commentators table and this new sort of table, which I really don't like because it looks like a laser tag arena. Like it looked really weird to me to just have this like strange, like laser tag-esque, sort of like futuristic industrial style table because I don't really associate that with poker. I also really found like from this point on with the applause that they piped in to be just like really annoying and over the top. And it really sounds like a VFX sound effect, and this happens in several hands, and it really just kind of takes me out of the experience. I really hate bad audio, like really bad sound effects or sound mixing really tends to take me out of things, even more so than bad visuals. And this
Mhm.
happened, like 3 or 4 times in each of these episodes moving forward.
Besides that, they had this new graphic. It's like cone of light from a
Mhm.
sky view of the table. That would be like this player raised from this position, and then this player over here, called that. And again, it was usually just like a recap of a hand that just happened. And again, it didn't feel like it added much. And it was an experiment, I suppose. They wanted to mix in new ways to analyze a hand. But again, I thought it was just a big miss personally.
Yeah, one thing that I kind of liked was that for the chip sets, they do kind of like an aerial shot so you can see the 6 players and they kind of like light them up and show like, this player has this many chips, this player has this many. I thought that was kind of neat. But yeah, that cone thing was really strange because again, it's like the critical review just goes over what happened more or less in the same amount of detail with a slightly different tone of voice. And it felt like it was replacing the critical review, but just doing the same thing that the critical review did.
Yeah, and there was definitely a concerted effort to have less information thrown on the screen for the audience to read in this season going
Mhm.
forward. They finally kind of wisened up, saying, no, it's not adding much to the content here. And then there'd be also a poker tips from Mike Sexton bit. Again, pretty short though, where it's like Sexton's on camera by himself talking about some, tip and then, obviously one per episode probably. And again, he doesn't really provide too many tips, while he's, in the booth with Vince. So I guess it was an effort to maybe add more education to the program, considering that they were dialing back other parts of it. But it didn't feel like it worked for me in just this one time that we saw
It
it.
reminded me how in season 1 of Apprentice they would cut to Donald Trump like trying to give like business advice, and it was just very superficial. Like I'm not trying to say anything about politics right now. I know we're a politics-free podcast,
Yeah.
but like this advice is just so superficial, and they clearly want it to be like a little educational, but it just doesn't work.
Yeah, and then they really just again we had that poker like Hollywood car bit with Vince and Mike a few ones back. There's really no side bits or off off the table
Hmm.
content on this in this season for some reason. They finally got rid of that weird like heads up like music like shot thing, which was
Hmm.
a good thing for me. But they also renamed the Wonder Cam to the Wonder Cam this season, and couldn't quite get rid of that awful recap at the halfway point of like, oh, this happened earlier, and then let's get back. It's like just get rid of the recaps. We're trust the audience that they're watching the whole thing.
Yeah, and there are, again, 5-second interview segments where you just don't learn anything. There is at one point, Sabina goes out and interviews David Williams's mother. So, you get like a little clip of her saying like, "Oh, I'm so excited," but again, it's just too short for it to be really effective.
Yeah. Getting to the actual poker here again, our finalist text David Williams, who was again the runner-up to Greg Raymer, who we interviewed for episode number 50 a couple of years ago. Devin Porter, Stan Weiss, our chip leader, who was actually the only amateur at the table, which is kind of funny. Steve Frederick, Robert Misraki, brother of the grinder, and Marcel Luce, our nemesis of Marcel Luce, Kerry Demetriou, who made it deep in the main event 04, who for me is kind of like the MVP of this final table, if you ask me. And
Definitely.
I'm sorry.
Absolutely. Yeah, he
And
really brought it.
again, the chip counts are actually, I mean, there's a bit of a, it's kind of the top two, and then they're pretty clustered in the next four spots for the most part. I mean, the blinds are 15K, 30K, which is the biggest opening level that we've had for a final table. But again, that could kind of just be because they had more players and because maybe player will hang on a little bit longer than past years they were. And so I felt this probably had the most fun action, crazy back and forth runouts of any table that we've covered for this WPT so far.
Yeah, this was my favorite final table out of all of them, honestly. I just really liked the action. Harry Demetriou, excuse me, really brought it. Like he was really, really fun to watch. Really kind of hamming it up a bit. And Stan Weiss is also kind of fun in a different way. Like, Harry Demetriou is kind of hamming it up, and Stan Weiss is a little bit more subtle, a little bit more internal. But you can still tell, like when he's mad, you can tell when he's tilting, you can tell when things are going his way, which is funny. And then David Williams and Robert Misraki are just, they're not like super, huge charismatic, presence at the table, but they're still enjoyable to have. And it's interesting to see, Robert Misraki versus Grinder, that kind of like sibling rivalry going back and forth between, the two of them, who's going to be more successful at the WPT. This was an interesting final table to see. And then, Devin Porter and Steve Frederick, didn't do anything that ticked me off. So, they seemed like fine guys.
So what something I noticed here was I did like the early narrative of Ms. Rucky's fall from 2 million to out early
Mhm.
on. I think that is pretty good at giving us enough hands to fully show someone's fall from grace like that.
Right.
That's one advantage of having double the time that the main event would have usually. And Demetriou, he was a very kind of like he felt like the players that took offense to D. McKelly and the '08 horse, where it's like, the old folks of poker, you got to act this way. He felt kind of like that in '04 with Josh Arroyo and all that stuff. And
Yeah.
seeing him kind of be a bit more open and talkative and poker acting and stuff like that, it was a surprise for me to see him do that at this table.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I remember very vividly, him and Josh are and him going to Josh are like, you just got lucky, like just take the win. But to see him, be more animated is very refreshing.
Yeah, and so in the early goings, we do lose Ms. Rocky in sixth place. So he went from 2 million chips, more than about 70-ish big blinds to out first, and he had queens against kings, flopped the straight flush draw, and bricked the Stan. And so that obviously gets Stan even more chips as he's increasing his chip lead at that point. And then we get some back and forth, river bust out. So for example, Steve. Frederick Buss on the river to do Williams with 9-5 on which of all things. And so again, those river bust outs, we don't see them all that often in the main event. At the final table, usually it's they're just dominated pre-flop and their hands hold up. So it's again fun to see those surprise river cards.
Yeah, that was a really sick hand to watch. I mean, he just calls with 9-5, and he hits runner two pair to knock him out in fifth place. Just very sick.
Yeah, and then as things go on, David Williams flops a straight with 7-6 to double up through Stan when he has King 3 and a blemish blind. Again, it's just kind of fun to flop a straight or flop a flush. It's just when poker. I mean, it's fun to make a set, but I just feel like flopping that straight is just so satisfying.
It is satisfying, yeah.
And then for me, like possibly the highlight of this entire 7 episode of content that we reviewed here is the sort of bizarre chip acting by Demetriou when he has ace. So the hand prior, he had won a hand, and so the next hand's being dealt, and he's still like stacking his chips. And so because he's doing that, he's sort of like, he's acting obviously, but it's good timing because then he induces Stan to raise and then somehow call off an all in with King five suited. I mean, it was pretty insane. It's kind of hard to really describe in words here. You just kind of have to watch it to understand, but it was a pretty incredible hand.
Yeah, I mean, this had happened. This was right after the heels of a hand where, Harry had won against Stan, and Harry had called off a Stan flop bet with second pair. So you can kind of tell that Stan's a bit disgusted. So he was tilting a little bit, and then this happened with, yeah, just really bizarre acting, as you mentioned. Like he's stacking his chips, and you can tell it's over the top. I mean, it's just so strange. And then, yeah, I mean. I just don't know what to say. Like it was really a really strange, anomalous hand to see, and it was a lot of fun to watch. Um, yeah, it's
I
great.
mean, it was a 4.6 million double up for Demetriou, which is more chips than he would than the chip would have in heads up play. So that just speaks to just how many chips that was when you're still four-handed here. And later, just afterwards, David Williams does bust on a back and forth all in run out in fourth place. So we again still have our sort of our Batman and Joker still in there with three left together now. And again, there's a lot of back and forth with uh, Devin getting crippled down to less than one big blind, and then he actually wins his next two hands to double and then triple up. And so if he wins that next hand afterwards, he's actually kind of back in it. But he does not, unfortunately. He's out in third place. But it's fun to when the short stack gets a little bit of hope because like when a guy like Kelly Kim busts in eighth place in the main event, and we don't even get to see the hand he busts out in full totality, you compare that to this run out here where at least we get to see some false hope at least.
Yeah, it was also funny before this happens that there's a hand between Harry and Stan where like Harry loses the hand because Stan hits trips on the river and he like says like, "Oh, I'm paying my dues for overacting." So it's Harry's not just being a jerk. Like he kind of like is aware of his own table image and all that. And also like there's a cut to the commentator's booth and like Vince jumps out of his seat as Stan hits trips on the river to double up through Harry, which just adding to the theatricality. It's moments like that where the tackiness kind of works a little bit and it becomes endearing. So that's another good hand.
Yeah, and something I'd also noted that they mentioned a couple times in this final table that a couple of the players were satellite entrants in the tournaments, which means they didn't pay the full 10K. And so again, imagine the ROI on that. That's pretty incredible. You pay like $200 and you win $500,000 off of that. That's that'd be pretty cool. I'm not quite sure. I mean, what would be more fun, winning like would you rather get sixth place as a satellite entrance or would you rather get like fifth place as like a buy-in? I mean, I don't know. What's more fun? I don't know.
What do you how do you what's more money, I
I guess
guess.
it's more money, I guess. I don't know, but also how much like the multiplier, how much money you won. I don't know. I'm just thinking about
Yeah.
it out loud. So by heads up time, we still have 15 minutes of the episode to show the battle. And again, it's Demetriou against Stan, who again had squared off earlier in the with the chip betting hand. And it's they're fairly close, but the problem is that the blinds are getting up there, so they don't have as nearly as much room to play poker. That's not just all in pre-flops. And there was a pretty aggressive hand by Stan with Queen 10 that manages to outplay Harry's King 10, which again, when the money's not all in pre-flop, it's kind of sometimes hard. The first aggressor will usually win those hands.
Yeah, and they showed the turn card that would have been a king, so Harry would have won the hand. So Stan did a good job getting him off there. And once that happens, it's, Stan has like nearly a 2-1 chip lead, and then it's, kind of just leaning on him until he falls over. The last hand is King 5 versus King 6. So Harry Harry busts because Stan hits a river 5. So kind of just, really that kind of hand just kind of brings everything together, just the kind of crazy chips and the swings that everybody's going through.
Yeah, and it's a $1.3 million top prize, which again pales in comparison to the main event's top prize. But you have to remember this is still a fraction. Again, this is '06. This was the Jamie Gold year, which was the biggest main event for almost 20 years up afterwards. And so again, that was over 8,000 players. This one we only have 384, and so actually proportionally speaking, the top prize really isn't that bad. It's
Mhm.
just because of how top heavy that prize is.
Yeah, it's not a bad prize at all, and especially for Stan, who's kind of like an amateur player, that's a pretty big score for him, and for Harry too. I mean, second place, is like 500,000. That's pretty good.
Actually, it was $637,000,
Yeah, pretty good.
which was way more than he won for that. I want to say like was it like 19th or 20th place finish in the main event or whatever it was, or
Something like that.
yeah. So
I'll have to
again,
look it
good
up.
for Harry. And again, he played a great game, and he's really kind of vanished from the poker world to the best of my knowledge since those the mid 2000s. So it was good to see him in this spell here.
Yeah, he got 18th in the 2004
Excuse
main
me,
event.
18. That's right.
And he got 147,500 for that. So this is
Yeah.
a good score.
That's like more than four times that. So there you go. Which gets us to season 7 of the.
Six.
I'm sorry, season 6. Sorry, I skipped one too far. Yeah, so once again we have the Mirage Poker Showdown, which again that doesn't really bother me that it's the same location for the first episode. I don't think it really matters
Hmm.
too much. We have this weird sort of like helicopter intro sequence, which they'll use in the next season as well. And they were I think slightly faster to kind of hop into the poker action. Like they didn't wait as long
Hmm.
to intro each player and get into the first hand of the deal. And they also didn't use the same graphics again. They're slightly different. And once again, a new floor host. We have Layla Cayley, who, again, it gets less to do than most of her predecessors, unfortunately. So it's kind of hard to compare how they compare to each other. But so much for that. They still use the split screen thing, but then the music's no longer used. It's obviously that was heads up. But then they still didn't get rid of that darn cone of light thing.
Yeah, the cone of light thing was weird. We're back to the laser tag set again, which again I just don't like. Um, yeah, the chip counts for this one were fairly even. We have Phil Ivey as the number one with 1.395 million, then Corey Carroll in second 1.235. And they kind of again tried to play it up like Phil Ivey, like he's this big player and he's against, some online, hot guns, and then there's a couple amateurs there. And that narrative again kind of bobs and weaves throughout the episode. But yeah, like, nothing super substantial in this season, which again, this was what year was this? This was 2006,
7 to 8.
2007 to 8. So, the poker boom starting to, subside. You have, restrictions on online gambling. So, maybe they're just kind of scaling back things a little bit here. But, you still have enough of an audience for poker that I think you can change things a little bit more and make some more interesting edits.
I mentioned that the beer toast at the end of season 5 was actually called Budweiser this time. So clearly the Amber Bock was no longer a thing. But then in
Mhm.
season 6, the beer toast doesn't have the brand mentioned at the end, at least not for this
Oh.
episode. So it's kind of funny that they dropped that. Maybe they with sponsors pulling back because of other the Black Friday thing. Maybe that was why that, or not Black Friday, but the poker act online poker act thing. That was probably a part of it, if you have to ask, if I had to guess. And so you mentioned Ivy was the chip leader with the final 6 here, and you actually didn't have nearly as many big blinds as our chip leaders had in episodes
Mhm.
past. Like with the blinds 12K, 24K at like 1.4 million, that's only about like not even 60 big blinds. So I think we had like guys of like 70, 80, 90, 100 in past final tables at the chip leader. So again, there's less room for error. And also they're much closer together in chip stacks than they had been before. So that might have played a role in the outcome had Ivy not been, spanked harder than I've seen Ivy be run over in poker in a long time.
Yeah, it's not quite collusion, but if we found out in retrospect that they were colluding against Phil Ivey, I would I would I
Not
wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, poor Phil. I mean, he just keeps getting, into these really terrible spots. And to be fair, I don't really think he plays super well at this table either. Like this might be the worst play I've really seen from him. He just opens too many pots. He plays too many hands. To be sure, I mean, he gets, ace five, ace jack, king queen, but still, like, I think you need to, tighten your range a little bit more. And maybe it's a little weird for me to be judging Phil Ivey here, but he does admit to it after he busts out like, yeah, I think I opened up too many hands, and yeah, that's definitely the case in this setup.
Well, also the problem is that people just kept betting when he had nothing. Like it's
Yeah.
kind of hard. Like it's fine if players want to. It's usually a good thing if players bet when you're in a hand because you get information that way, and if you have a hand, then you can capitalize. But he literally has like king high, ace high, pair of threes every time he was bet into, and so you're just kind of trapped there. You gotta fold almost all those spots, and When you're the chip leader, you don't want to put too many bluff rays out there early on. You want to get a feel for the table first. And so I kind of feel like he didn't play bad, if you ask me. He just didn't run good and didn't play, Ivy level poker. He played, below his A game, maybe his, C plus game, which is better than most players on average, but not when you're at this, pretty aggressive table.
Yeah, I mean, even Sexton just kind of seems exasperated by it. Like he says, like, this is the first time Phil's been called chum, things like that. I mean, yeah, he gets fifth place. He doesn't, bust right away. But yeah, I mean, definitely you'd expect more out of Phil.
Also, he gets the money in good. He makes a flush when his opponent has trips, and then they make a full house. So
Yeah.
it's not like he misplayed the last hand. And also, what I liked was as they're framing kind of Ivy as the man to beat here, they show a montage of his past sound bites of saying, "I'm gonna win this one," because
Yeah.
this was he was now several final tables into the WPT at this point. He just had never closed it out, and so. Again, I like when they are able to set up a narrative of this player has been here before. Let's see if he can finally conquer the past and win one. And so again, it was fun to see that be established early on.
Yeah, this was his seventh final table without a win. So it must be pretty sick to, be at seven final tables and be Phil Ivey so accomplished and just not quite seal the deal.
I think he had mentioned this was his first time being the chip leader in
Mhm.
one of these final tables. So again, you expect to at least make it to the top two, top three, on average. And also, if you've been to seven final tables and there's final, it's six-handed, you mathematically are supposed to win one of them, right? So
Yeah.
there you go. Besides that, we actually had a pretty fast pace of bust outs at this episode. Like usually, they're pretty equally spliced throughout the episode. This one we had the first three bust outs less than halfway into the action, which was, it mixed things up compared to past seasons at least. I knew about Jonathan Little from I feel like some like 2010 era-ish poker, and then
Hmm.
I knew Ivy obviously, but everybody else I didn't really know. The name Daryl Dickett and Amon Philippi I've heard before, but I don't really know like where it was or who they are. But everybody else was unknown to me.
Yeah, same here. Like Corey Carroll, like a little bit, Daryl Dickin a little bit. So it was kind of interesting to see, down to three-handed that it was, Cordy Daryl and Jonathan Little, three-handed. And three-handed was I think, the real heart of this episode. It was really interesting. I really had no idea who was going to win. It was really back and forth. Really, everybody just kind of swinging for the fences and trying to pull this one off, which was exciting to see. A lot of different hands too. I mean, we're not talking optimal hands here. We're talking, 7-5 versus 10-8. We're talking, 9-6 versus 8-7. So it was really fun to see that.
Yeah, and with the action, we have a lot of doubling up and surviving, doubling up, and the chip lead changing and the short stack changing. So that always makes for fun stuff. Like it reminded me of the 2012 final table with Jesse Sylvia, Jake Ballsinger, and Merson, where the
Oh, yeah.
action was so crazy. Again, wasn't quite that high stakes as far as money at stake, but it was still it reminded me of that in a good way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then as heads up boils down to Corey Carroll up against Jonathan Little, and they're actually pretty close to equal in heads up. So that, but they only have like 30 big blinds each. So that leaves a little bit of room for some poker creativity, but not a ton. It's we've seen worse, we've seen more. And early on, Corey definitely gets the better of things. Having better cards, better runouts and whatnot. But then a big flip for Jonathan, fives against ace eight, sort of starts the ball rolling for him to win things.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting how the episode ends that, there's that double up, then there's an ace nine versus ace six hand where they split, and then there's ace seven versus ace deuce, but Jonathan managed to hit the deuce, and that ultimately does Corey in. So it's kind of funny to see like, as I was watching this for the first time, I'm like, okay, ace seven versus ace deuce, I guess it's another split pot, and then that happened. And it's also interesting to see like Jonathan or Corey like really didn't show any emotion after it was done, which is understandable. I mean, it's an overwhelming moment. You've just been through a pretty difficult three-handed action, so I kind of get it. But it's just kind of funny, like just crack a smile. You just won $1 million.
Yeah, I mean, so at this point we were 6 seasons in, and so I definitely would have put this maybe like second or third on my hierarchy. Definitely, one of the better ones. And it definitely felt like aggression was the main tool, like the main poker tool on display here. Which aggression is usually a good thing as long as you're not, you know, aggressive in the wrong situation. I felt that Mike in the booth was definitely way too easily impressed by certain players' calls. Like, oh, what a call! He made a call with only an ace 10 when he's up against ace 9. It's like it's ace 10. I mean, it's a good hand, and he's got to read on his opponent. I mean, don't make it out to be like the biggest call of all time, but just make it it's a good play.
Yeah, there were also multiple times, you're going back to the whispering for a second, where Mike Sexton was whispering so quietly, I couldn't understand what he was saying, and also his accent. So it was just like, shh, 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 shh. Like I just couldn't hear him. So that's just, I mean, that happened like I think 3 or 4 times during this episode, like enough to notice a pattern of it. They really just needed to stop doing that.
And one new graphic for this season was once they got to three-handed, they showed the chip counts as like percentage of how many chips they had in play. And this was,
Mhm.
this was when they were all fairly equal. But so it was kind of strange to only use that three-handed. I think it could have been cool to have that maybe 2 or 3 times in total rather than just only once.
Yeah, that would have been nice to see.
But at that point, again, it's still kind of trending better. So, I felt that season 5 and season 6 were, superior than most of the other ones. So I thought that we were trending up in the right direction, which was good. And then we get to season 7, which finally does give us a different location for the opening event of that, poker season. In this case, being the Bellagio Cup. So we kind of circled all the way back to the Bellagio from the beginning here with not only the biggest event so far, but the biggest buy-in for the event so far.
Yeah, and also a lot of chips, sort of at the table. Mike Watson, the player in first with 5 million, David Benjamin right behind him at 4.86. So, they clearly wanted to like beef up the stack sizes. They, clearly trying to like hype this up a little bit, which is kind of interesting because I feel like this, the intro was the same as the previous year. It was more or less the same in terms of its presentation style. So this is just kind of where they feel like, all right, poker's reached its peak. We're just going to do another season and kind of just go through the motions. Though they get a new like I don't know, field correspondent woman out in the crowd, Amanda Leatherman, who's most people know probably as Daniel Negreanu's wife, who again like only had like one interview, I think, and
That
like
is
did
right.
the recap, like barely any screen time whatsoever. So it makes me wonder, like, why are they cycling through, these field correspondents every season? Just keep the same one from last year.
I mean, I guess maybe it's just it 1 year contracts and they just didn't renew or they wanted more money and they didn't get it. I don't know. Southwest Airlines jumps in as a sponsor for the WPT here, and the beer toast at the end of the episode now gone. No more. I mean, it was weird how they went from Amber Bock to Budweiser to no brand to now no beer toast at all. So I guess they're just trying to cut back on the alcohol consumption. I don't know. And with this episode structure for the season, they now would throw in at the halfway point a next time on WPT. So now it's as if this was like 1 hour episodes on the channel schedule rather than 1 2 hour block, which again, I was a little surprised it took them as long as this to do that, but nonetheless, they do have that here now.
Yeah, and I also noticed just like fewer interview segments overall, just kind of just again just felt like a little bit less effort. Like I said, like my theory is that this is again after the online act had come in and brought online poker down. So they just felt like, all right, we've kind of reached its peak. We'll just kind of go through the motions here on this one. And the action is fine. I mean, we can get into the details, but like nothing like really jumped out at me about this one and grabbed my attention. So
Well, a couple of details did jump out to me actually. It was also like how often the players would ask like for a chip count from their opponents, like how
yeah.
much you got, especially in a few scenarios where it didn't make sense to ask for it. Like if somebody had you out chipped and or if it's like hand number 2 of the night, and so the chip counts are almost the same as when the day began, so you should kind of know in your head. So, for example, simple example here, we have John Fan asks Ralph Perry for a chip count on the second hand of the night, and it's like, well, you and even the booth calls him up for this. Like, it just doesn't make sense to ask that, and Ralph gets actually a little testy about the question when it's again pretty dumb to ask that in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand like trying to get a read, trying to kind of see where somebody's at, but like the second hand, that is kind of strange. You maybe want to wait until a little bit later. I mean, if John Fed was trying to tilt Ralph Perry, it worked because Ralph Perry really got mad at him. Not to the point of like screaming at him, but like in between hands, they're still talking about it, which is very strange.
And then another verbal, not faux pas quite, but kind of like unique thing is that whenever Gabriel Thaler went all in, he would say, "I bet it all," or
Yeah.
if he was a mid-hand, he'd say, "I bet the rest of it." Which again, it is not wrong. It's not grammatically wrong. It's not cheating or anything. It's just not the usual poker terminology. So I just was surprised that he stuck to that verbal utterance as much times as he did.
It reminded me when John Robert Belland went all in. I think it was in the '08 WSOP, and he said, "I play all my chips."
Yeah.
It's just kind of like a weird, yeah, little thing to say. And maybe I'll start saying that. Maybe that'll work.
And you mentioned how there were, much more chips in play. And yeah, we had it felt like almost like close, not quite 20 million, but like pretty close, like about 20 million chips in play. But
Hmm.
typically when the bigger the tournament's buy-in, the more like the higher denomination chips are used. So like the main event has a 10K buy-in and they would do 60K in chips. The one drop, you get like 3 million chips. So usually it's like a, multiplier of so the buy-in here was 15,000 up from 10K. So I guess that was where they got the more chip counts from. Also, there was more players in play, but yeah, a little
Hmm.
bit strange there. Um, as far as this table here, I really only knew Benjamin from his appearance on like High Stakes Poker
Hmm.
or After Dark. Like, I really didn't know the rest of the field. Their names sounded like vaguely familiar. I mean, John Pham was a pretty common last name, so I wasn't sure if that was the same one that maybe I'd heard before. But again, this is probably the table I knew the least about, and at least the one player I did know survived till the very end.
Yeah, I'd heard Mike Watson before, I think.
Yeah,
I
me too.
remember Ralph Perry from Tony G like having a hand with him and saying like, "Come on, Russian, get out" or something. But I don't really know much about him.
Yeah,
And yeah, like John Fenn, vaguely familiar, but Luke Stottenmeyer and Gabriel Fowler I never heard of. So
right.
I didn't really have any expectations for this final table, really.
Yeah, and again, besides the table antics, like I thought the rivalry of Ralph and John Pham was decent as far as some animosity building. And it was unfortunate that Gabriel with his I Bet It Alls was out first, but he was also the short stack when play began. Um, with the rest of the action here, I felt that it was not wasn't bad. I felt like it was kind of like middle tier as far as the seven episodes were concerned. It wasn't anything that was like super crazy. No like crazy Harry Demetriou chip acting moments, but nothing terrible. And also there was not really any filler or fluff in this episode because they had cut all that up at this point.
Yeah, nothing super exciting. A lot of kind of just hands playing themselves. A lot of three bet raises and folds, I've noticed. A lot of shoves and folds. Poker, poker, fine poker, nothing super out of line, but nothing that's super exciting
Yeah.
either.
And despite the increase in field size and the buy-in size, the first prize 1.6 million, not substantially bigger. It's like about half a million more, maybe a little bit less than the last couple of years, but still the biggest prize pool we've seen so far.
Yeah, I mean, 1.6 million is still, plenty of money, but you'd think like this is the World Poker Tour. This is so prestigious. Like, they hype up the World Poker Tour while watching the World Poker Tour, Like Mike Sexton repeatedly says over and over again, like, everybody wants to win a WPT prize. Everybody wants to be a champion at the WPT, and it's, 1.6 million in comparison to what's at the main event, just doesn't have that quality.
Like $8 million compared to 1.6 million. I mean, people. I feel like WPT titles and bracelets for the World Series of Poker are kind of like the two big things in poker. Like I guess that they're trying to make the Poker Go Tour events be, bigger, but I couldn't care less. And so I ask you, Sam, how would you value a WPT title versus a bracelet? Which one, like as far as like a one to like a numeric comparison, which one would you value more?
Uh,
And how much?
That's a I mean, maybe like three WPT events to one WSOP bracelet, I think.
I mean, because there are much more bracelets per year than titles. So it's kind of a weird sort of opposite polarity. I
Yeah.
almost feel like, I mean, I'm happy either way, of course, but
Right.
I guess I would say like I wouldn't quite go 3 to 1. I maybe even go like 1.5 to 1, if that makes sense. Like
Mhm.
because I feel like if I won two WPT events, that's pretty cool. But a bracelet is something you wear. I mean, it's a trophy versus a bracelet. But I don't know. It's not as easy an answer for me as maybe it was for you.
I feel like the WPT just isn't as prominent as the WSOP is. And like you win a WSOP bracelet, like you are a poker champion, you are seen as the big deal. Versus like, the WPT, especially, recently, like I don't really hear anybody talk about winning WPT events or who the WPT player of the year is. Like
That's
I'm
true.
looking at the list. The WPT player of the year for season 22 was Yoon Kyu Song, who doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. 2023, Bin Wang also doesn't have a Wikipedia page.
Yeah,
It's just not as prestigious and notable as the WSOP is, I think.
that's fair. Again, I'd probably have to really rack my brain to give the most accurate answer. But again, I'd be happy the other way. So it's kind of
Yeah, of
it's
course.
kind of a weird question here. As far as getting to my overall thoughts in my sort of end thought notes section, having watched all seven, when we were discussing watching this content, we had first discussed the idea of just watching all of one season. But I felt that I might have really gotten bored or annoyed by the end of watching like 17 of these, like back to back to back. So I'm kind of glad we chose to watch one at a time, one of each season rather than going crazy. I don't know if you agree with me, but I thought that the chip riffling, especially in the first couple of seasons, felt very like almost looked very amateurish, like just how they
Mhm.
were like it felt like they were just I don't know. I don't know if you agree. It's kind of hard to, it's a little subjective, but I felt it just didn't feel right.
Yeah, it was kind of strange. Yeah, people were doing all sorts of different things with their hands. They were putting them on their shoulders or putting them over their cards. But yeah, some of the chiffre thing was a little weird.
And then besides wired pair, I thought that the other poker term that I've never heard anywhere before flush, where like if you would flush draw, they call it a just call it a flush draw. Don't forget calling it a four flush. I don't know if there's like a patent on flush draw. Just call it a don't call it a four flush, please.
Yeah, I also they kept mentioning that a 9-5 hand was a Dolly Parton because she did that song, working 9 to 5, which I've heard before, but this was like the most that I've heard that hand being referred to as.
And then there was a good number of times where a player would raise and they would announce like how much more rather than like the total amount. So like
Oh yeah,
if you bet 100,000 and I won like half a million, I would say 400,000 more. Like just I don't know. I thought you should just be better off just saying how much you're making it in total rather than how much more you're making it.
absolutely. I noticed that a lot. Yeah.
And then really they didn't ever discuss like how many big blinds a player had. Like maybe like two or three times in over and we watched 7 times an hour and a half. That's about 10 hours of poker. They maybe mentioned like he has like 10 big blinds left like three times ever, which is much different than now modern poker does.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then I guess my last note here is that too often the booth considered a bet that makes a worst hand fold a great play. Like if you have the best hand, I mean, there are times where you want someone to not, draw to their flush or their pair draws. But I feel like it's not a great play if you have two pair and you get like one pair to fold. Like you want them to call more often than not.
Yeah, I think so too, yeah.
So again, just little things that didn't quite sit right in the booth as far as how they would commentate. Which again, I wouldn't call them nearly as poor level as the High Roller Bowl was with Kara Scott and Jesse Sylvia. That's still like for me like the worst. And then you have like no commentary at all is like second worst. And I guess I kind of put these guys like third or maybe fourth from the bottom if you count the Heads Up Championship commentary is probably worse than them actually.
Yeah, I mean, overall, like, I appreciated watching this. It was kind of fun to finally watch, poker on television versus all the movies and documentaries we've seen. Um, yeah, the word I keep going back to is tacky. I know. I'm sorry. I'm a broken tape recorder just saying the same things. Yeah, it just the way the lighting is, the way the sets are, the fact that this is taking place, after the tournament has played out, that we don't see how the tournament played out until then. The speed at which graphics are shown at the screen and the speed at which segments are, it just all feels very artificial in comparison to the WSOP. Did fool me with the commentators booth. I mean, I'll give them that. Um, it is fun to watch when there's good banter between the players, and it's fun to see some of the action. But I mean, I just prefer the WSOP overall. I appreciate watching this. I'd be curious to see how it is nowadays. Maybe I'd watch like the WPT Championship, at the end of a season, just to kind of see like, how the champions all square against each other. It might be interesting to look at. But yeah, like it just doesn't quite hold up to me.
Yeah, I mean, they got rid of a lot of the like OCD clutter in the early seasons by having fewer things on screen and having like every 2 seconds something new is on screen, like a poker wisdom quote or something like that. They got rid of that, so they learned a few lessons along the way. And again, this is even season seven. That's still almost that's like 18 years ago. So that's still a lot. I'm sure they've adapted and evolved over the years since then. So I would be curious to maybe come back and maybe see some of the more middle era and then modern era stuff, see how they've adapted. But yeah, I echo most of the same thoughts that they just voiced there. But I'm still glad that we have added to our full rounded look of the poker media world and added this to our watch list.
Yeah, I mean, this has been something we've been wanting to do for a while, and we finally were like, oh, we should just watch these. I mean, it was just like staring us in the face, basically. I appreciate watching this too. Like, I'm not angry at the WPT or anything. It doesn't hold up.
And imagine a what if universe where we had grown up watching this rather than the main event on ESPN, then we'd watch these in reverse order. I'd be very curious if anybody listening to us now grew up watching the WPT on the Travel Channel and then watched ESPN afterwards, and how that compare and contrast work from the other side of things. So let us know in the comment section what your thoughts are on WPT, and if you prefer this versus ESPN's old school look back or the Poker Go era. Let us know sort of where this all ranks for you. Again, I still put this above the worst years of the main event coverage that we've discussed at length here, but definitely doesn't hold up to the the mean average of like the old school classic era.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where I would fall to.
And we're only 4 days away now from the official dropping of the Madison documentary on YouTube for free. So people can check it out without having to go on Amazon Prime and see my lovely little cameo, and we can immortalize that with some snapshot coverage of that, so we can keep that in our memory banks for forever. And Sam, we've been talking now for almost 2 hours about this content. So great work, and we'll discuss as we near the magical episode number 100 what we'll be doing to celebrate that moment. And let us know in the comment section if anything you want us to review in a later episode.
Yeah, and yeah, we're definitely, as we mentioned earlier, we're really happy to do interviews and we're happy to talk to, old school or main event folks. So if anybody played in the main event back in the day, even if you didn't make the final table, if you didn't make a deep run, we'd be really curious to have you on the show. And, we're always looking for new content ideas. We finally got around to this, the World Poker Tour, and I'm glad we did. So, if there's any other television shows that are out there that you'd like us to review, just let us know.
Exactly. Until next time, guys, enjoy your poker, enjoy your TV, and enjoy your poker on TV.
May all your hands be live and all your pots be monsters, except the ones you lose.
Good night, guys.